The dust never settled in Cold Creek. It hung in the air like something living, something that fed on the town's quiet desperation. Ronan Hale noticed it the moment his horse crossed into the valley, the way the wind carried ash instead of prairie grass, the way the buildings leaned just slightly wrong, like they were trying to escape their own foundations. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, following a letter that shouldn't have reached him. The paper had been folded so many times the creases were splitting, the ink smeared by what might have been water or might have been tears. Please, it said. Just that one word and a name. Eliza Briggs. Ronan didn't know any Eliza Briggs. Didn't know Cold Creek either, though he'd heard the name whispered in towns 200 miles east, always in the past tense, always with that particular shade of resignation people used when talking about places already dead. The main street stretched ahead of him like a held breath. False front buildings painted in colors that had given up years ago. A general store with half its sign missing. A bank that looked more like a mausoleum. And at the far end, the Prairie Rose Saloon, 2 stories of weathered wood and broken promises. People moved on the boardwalks, but they moved wrong. Too quick or too slow. Never meeting each other's eyes, conversations dying mid-word when footsteps approached. A woman clutched her shawl tighter and disappeared into a doorway. 2 men who'd been talking suddenly found urgent business in opposite directions. Ronan had seen fear before. Hell, he'd caused enough of it. But this was different. This wasn't the sharp, hot fear of violence coming. This was the cold, grinding fear of violence that never stopped, that had become the weather, the wallpaper, the air itself. He guided his horse toward the saloon's hitching post, moving slow and obvious. In towns like this, sudden movements got you killed. His duster hung open despite the October chill, revealing the Colt at his hip. Not a threat, just information. He wanted them to see it. Wanted them to understand he wasn't prey. The saloon doors were the kind that swung both ways, hung on leather hinges that had seen better decades. Ronan pushed through into a room that smelled like stale beer, old smoke, and that particular brand of despair that soaked into wood over years of bad decisions. Maybe 15 people inside, though it was hard to tell in the dim light filtering through windows that hadn't been cleaned since Reconstruction. Most of them were nursing drinks they weren't drinking, having conversations they weren't having. The bartender, a rail-thin man with hands that shook when they weren't gripping something, looked up with the expression of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything years ago. "Whiskey," Ronan said, settling onto a stool that groaned under his weight. "The real stuff, if you've got it." The bartender's hand shook worse as he poured. "Passing through?" "Depends." "On what?" "On whether this town's got a place to sleep that won't steal my horse." A laugh from the corner, short, bitter, cut off quick. Ronan didn't turn to look. He was tracking 3 different conversations in the room's reflection in the mirror behind the bar, watching body language, reading the spaces between words. The whiskey burned going down, but it was honest burning. Real alcohol, not the wood grain poison some places sold. "You get a lot of strangers?" Ronan asked. "Onan or Shay?" The bartender's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to his rag and his endless, pointless wiping of the same glass. "Not anymore." "Used to?" "Used to be a lot of things?" The glass went back on the shelf with a dozen identical ghosts. "Boarding house is 2 streets over. Mrs. Chen runs it. Tell her Frank sent you, she might not triple the price." Ronan nursed his drink, watching the room settle back into its uneasy rhythm. Nobody looked at him directly, but everybody was looking at him. He'd been in enough tight spots to recognize the math being done behind careful eyes. Threat assessment, risk calculation, the endless weighing of whether engaging meant opportunity or execution. The doors swung open. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and it had nothing to do with the weather. 2 men walked in like they owned the place because they probably did. The first was massive, 6'4" easy, shoulders like a bull, face like 40 miles of bad road. The second was smaller but meaner, all wire and scar tissue, with eyes that had stopped seeing people as people sometime back when killing still bothered him. They wore dusters similar to Ronan's but cleaner, newer. Expensive leather gun belts with matching revolvers that had seen regular use and regular care. The big one had a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, tarnished silver that caught the light wrong. The room didn't just go quiet, it went empty. People found reasons to be somewhere else, sliding out with practiced efficiency, leaving half-finished drinks and full excuses. Within 30 seconds, The saloon held 6 souls: Ronan, the bartender, the 2 newcomers, and a drunk in the corner too far gone to care about staying alive. The big one, Deputy, apparently, walked straight to the bar. Not to Ronan, but close enough that the message was clear. His partner hung back by the doors, relaxed but ready, hand resting casual on his gun like it lived there. "Frank," Deputy said, his voice like gravel in a bucket. "Who's this?" Frank's hands had graduated from shaking to full tremors. "Didn't catch a name." "That's so." Deputy turned, finally looking at Ronan straight on. Up close, his face was a topographical map of violence. Broken nose, healed, crooked, scar through one eyebrow, the kind of wear that came from winning fights dirty. "You got a name, stranger?" Ronan took another sip of whiskey, let it sit on his tongue before swallowing. "Got several. Which one you want?" The deputy's eyes narrowed. "The real one." Ronan Hales. Something flickered across Deputy's face. Recognition, maybe, or the shape of it. "That's supposed to mean something?" "Depends who's asking." "I'm asking." Deputy's hand drifted toward his gun, casual as breathing. "I'm Deputy Marcus Kane, and this is my town. That means when strangers roll in, I get to know who they are, what they want, and how long they're staying." "Seems fair," Ronan said. "I'm nobody important. I want whiskey and a bed, and I'm staying as long as it takes." "As long as what takes?" "To decide if I like it here." Kane's partner moved from the door, circling wide to Ronan's left. Textbook pincer, nothing fancy, just solid intimidation tactics. Ronan tracked him in the mirror, noting the slight hitch in his walk. Old injury, left leg, probably the knee. Compensating by putting extra weight on the right, which meant his draw would pull left. "See, here's the thing," Kane said, leaning against the bar like they were old friends sharing confidences. "Cold Creek's a peaceful town. Real peaceful. We don't get much trouble because we don't tolerate trouble. You understanding me?" "Crystal clear." "Good. So here's how this works. You finish your drink, you get on your horse, and you ride back to wherever the hell you came from. Because we don't need whatever you're selling." Ronan set his glass down, empty. "I'm not selling anything." "Then what are you doing here?" Somebody asked for help. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Kane's casual lean transformed into something coiled, dangerous. His partner stopped moving, hand now fully on his gun. "Who?" Kane's voice had lost all pretense of friendly. "Didn't say I was telling you. I'm not asking nice." Ronan finally turned on his stool, slow and deliberate, giving them time to see it wasn't aggression. He faced Kane square, close enough to smell the man's breakfast whiskey and last night's sweat. "Here's my counteroffer. I finish my drink," which I did. "I find my boarding house. I mind my business. And you pretend this conversation never happened." Kane smiled, and it was uglier than his scars. "No." The partner drew first, fast, practiced, the kind of speed that came from drawing on unarmed men. His Colt cleared leather and was swinging up when Ronan moved. Not for his own gun, for Kane's. Ronan's left hand clamped on Kane's wrist as the big man's hand touched his weapon, twisting hard and up. His right hand slammed into Kane's elbow, hyperextending the joint with a wet pop. Kane's gun clattered to the bar as the deputy roared, trying to bring his other fist around. Ronan ducked under the haymaker, used Kane's own momentum to spin him, and shoved him into his partner just as the smaller man's gun finished its rise. The two collided, the partner's shot going wild, punching a hole in the ceiling that rained down dust and splinters. 3 seconds. That's all it had taken. Ronan had Kane's gun now, aimed at both men as they untangled themselves. His own Colt stayed holstered. "I said I'm not selling trouble," he said quietly. "I meant it, but I'm not buying it either." Kane clutched his arm, face purple with rage and pain. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Won't be the first time." Ronan backed toward the door, gun steady. "I'll be at Mrs. Chen's if you want to continue this conversation. Bring a warrant next time. Or don't. I'm flexible." He was through the doors and on his horse before they recovered enough to follow, riding at a trot that looked unhurried but covered ground fast. Behind him, he could hear Kane screaming orders, boots on boardwalks, the distinctive sound of a town organizing for violence. But Ronan had 3 blocks head start, and the advantage of not giving a damn about property damage. He cut through an alley, jumped a fence, scattered a chicken coop, and emerged on a side street just as pursuers pounded past 2 blocks over. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was exactly where Frank said, a narrow three-story building painted a faded yellow, with actual flowers in window boxes that someone still watered. A small miracle in Cold Creek. The woman who answered his knock was maybe 60, maybe 80. The kind of person time had stopped bothering to age. Tiny, rail straight, with eyes that had seen everything and forgiven nothing. Mrs. Chen? Who's asking? Frank sent me. I need a room. She looked him up and down, taking in the road dust, the careful way he held himself, the gun at his hip. You the one who just made Kane's boys look like fools? News travels fast. In a town this size, news travels before it happens. She stepped aside. $2 a night, paid in advance. Breakfast included if you don't mind eating early. You break anything, you buy it. You bring trouble to my door, I throw you out personally. Fair terms. They always are. She led him inside, up a staircase that creaked in harmony. You really here to help the Briggs girl? Ronan stopped mid-stare. How'd you... I'm old and Chinese in a white town in the middle of nowhere. You think I survived this long by being stupid? She didn't look back. Eliza Briggs is the only person in Cold Creek with the spine to ask for help and the brains to send the letter where it might do some good. So either you're him or you're the worst kind of liar. I'm him. Then you're probably a dead man. She unlocked a door on the second floor. Room's clean, water's in the pitcher, outhouse is out back. Lock your door and don't trust anybody. Including you? She smiled, and for just a second Ronan saw the young woman she'd been. Fierce, unbreakable, tired of everyone's nonsense. Especially me. But I'm the only one in this town who'll tell you the truth, so maybe that counts for something. She left him there, her footsteps fading down the stairs. The room was small but clean, a bed that looked like it might actually be comfortable, a washstand, a chair by the window that overlooked the street. Ronan locked the door, checked the window locks, tested the floorboards for squeaks, and identified 3 exit routes before he even took off his hat. Old habits, the kind that kept you breathing. He washed his face in the basin, cold water cutting through the day's dust. In the mirror, he looked tired. Hell, he was tired. Tired of towns like this, tired of men like Kane, tired of violence that never solved anything except who got to do more violence. But then he thought about that letter. That single word, please. Somebody had been desperate enough to reach out blind, to send a plea into the void, and hope it found someone who gave a damn. And somehow, through luck or fate or pure random chance, it had found him. He pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolded it one more time. The handwriting was precise despite the emotion behind it. Please. They're taking everything. If someone finds this, if someone reads this and still believes in justice, we need help. Cold Creek needs help. I need help. E. Briggs. Below that, an address. Briggs Ranch, 4 miles east. Ronan refolded the letter, tucked it back in his pocket. Outside, the sun was starting its descent, painting the dusty street in shades of amber and blood. He could hear normal town sounds, a dog barking, a wagon creaking, someone calling dinner. But underneath it all, that same held-breath silence. Tomorrow, he'd ride out to the ranch. Tonight, he needed information. He waited until full dark, then slipped out his window onto the roof of the neighboring building. Mrs. Chen had been right about one thing. Trouble was coming. He'd seen the look in Kane's eyes, the kind of rage that didn't cool overnight. They'd come for him, probably with friends, definitely with bad intentions. But Ronan had spent 20 years learning how to be somewhere he wasn't expected. The Prairie Rose Saloon was busier now, filled with the after-work crowd trying to drink away another day in Cold Creek. Ronan watched from the shadows across the street, counting bodies, identifying patterns. Most of the patrons were just regular folks, farmers, shop owners, the working broke who'd never be anything else. But scattered among them were Kane's men, easy to spot once you knew what to look for. They sat different, moved different, had that particular alertness of predators in familiar territory. Ronan counted 6, not including Kane himself or the partner from earlier. 8 total. Not an army, but enough. He was about to move on when the saloon doors opened and a woman stepped out. Even in the dim light from the saloon's windows, Ronan could see she was different from everyone else in Cold Creek. Mid-20s maybe, wearing riding clothes that had seen hard use but were well maintained. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Shoulders set like someone who'd been carrying weight too long but refused to set it down. She scanned the street with the same careful attention Ronan used, and for just a second, her eyes passed over his hiding spot. He didn't think she saw him, but he couldn't be sure. She started walking, not toward home but toward the edge of town, away from the light, into the kind of darkness that swallowed people who weren't careful. Ronan followed. He kept his distance, using the skills he'd learned tracking guerrillas through Missouri forests 20 years back. She moved with purpose, never looking back, but taking a route that was deliberately complex. Down alleys, through yards, over fences. Either she was paranoid or she was smart. Probably both. She ended up at a small church on the southern edge of town, one of those structures that had been white once but had settled into gray defeat. The door wasn't locked. She went inside. Ronan gave it a 3 count, then followed. The interior was dark except for a single candle near the altar. Pews lined up in neat rows, hymnals gathering dust, the smell of old wood and older prayers. The woman stood at the front, her back to him. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she said without turning, following me in the dark. Ronan stayed by the door, hands visible. "Could say the same about you, walking alone in a town like this. I've been walking alone in this town for over a year." She turned, and in the candlelight, he could see her face clearly for the first time. Strong features, eyes that had learned to hide emotion, a jawline set in permanent defiance. "You must be Ronan Hale." "Must be. I'm Eliza Briggs." "Figured." They studied each other across the empty church, 2 strangers bound by a letter. Neither of them entirely trusted. "You actually came," Eliza said, and there was something in her voice, not hope exactly, but maybe the memory of what hope used to feel like. "You actually asked." "I asked 6 months ago. Sent 12 letters to 12 different places, 12 different names I'd heard in passing. People who supposedly helped when the law wouldn't." She crossed her arms. "You're the first to show up. Maybe I'm the only one who got the letter. Or maybe you're the only one stupid enough to answer it." She walked down the aisle, each step deliberate. "This town is dying, Mr. Hale. Not quickly, slowly, like something bleeding out. A man named Silas Vane is killing it, piece by piece, and nobody can stop him because he's smart enough not to break laws he can be caught for. Kane works for him. Kane is him, in all the ways that matter. The deputy badge is decoration. The real power is Vane's money, Vane's contracts, Vane's system." She stopped 3 pews away. "And in 2 weeks, my family's ranch, the last piece of property in this valley not under his control, becomes his too." "How?" "Debt. Perfectly legal debt, with perfectly legal contracts signed by my father before he understood what he was signing." Her voice stayed level, but her hands clenched. "Vane's lawyers are better than ours. His bankers are his judge." She laughed, bitter. "Well, let's just say justice and the law aren't the same thing anymore." Ronan moved closer, reading her face in the candlelight. "You've been fighting this for a year?" "Longer, since my father died, which was convenient timing for Vane, by the way. Heart attack, they said. But my father was healthy as an ox until he started standing up to the land grabs." She met his eyes. "I can't prove it was murder. I can't prove half of what I know. That's the problem." "What can you prove?" Eliza reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn leather journal. "Everything and nothing. Dates, transactions, conversations, threats. 14 families forced out in 18 months. Pattern of debt manipulation. Witness statements from people too scared to testify. It's all here, documented, cross-referenced, absolutely useless in any court where Vane has influence." She handed him the journal. Ronan flipped through it, page after page of precise handwriting, dates, numbers, names. The work of someone who'd been screaming into the void and writing down every word just in case someone finally heard. "This is good work," he said quietly. "It's desperate work, and it's not enough." She took the journal back. "I need someone who can do what the law won't. Someone who can stop Vane not by proving he's a criminal, but by making it too costly for him to continue being one." "You want me to kill him?" "No." The word was sharp, immediate. "I want you to break him. I want his system dismantled, his empire collapsed, his men scattered. I want him to lose everything the way he's made us lose everything. And then, when he's finally vulnerable, finally exposed, I want the law to finish what we started." Ronan handed back the journal. "That's a tall order." "I know. Might get a lot of people hurt." "People are already hurt. Every day Vane operates, more families lose everything." She tucked the journal back in her jacket. "I'm not asking you to be a hero, Mr. Hale. I'm asking you to be a weapon. Point yourself at the right targets and pull the trigger. And if I miss, then I lose my ranch, leave Cold Creek, and spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have done more." She started toward the door, then stopped. "But at least I'll know I tried everything. Can you say the same?" She didn't wait for an answer. The door closed behind her, leaving Ronan alone with the candle and the silence and a decision that felt heavier than any gun he'd ever carried. He stayed in the church for another hour, thinking through angles, weighing odds, mapping out the kind of campaign that would either save this town or bury him under it. This wasn't a simple fight. This was chess played with lives, where the board kept changing and the rules were whatever Vane said they were. But Ronan had played games like this before. In the war, in the years after, in a dozen towns that thought power meant permission. He'd learned that empires, no matter how strong, were held together by belief. Make enough people stop believing, and the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards in a stiff wind. The question was whether he cared enough to try. Outside, Cold Creek slept fitfully under a moon that didn't care about justice or debt or the slow murder of hope. Somewhere in the dark, Cain was planning revenge. Somewhere else, Vane was counting money made from other people's desperation. And somewhere in between, families were going to bed wondering if tomorrow would be the day they lost everything. Ronan blew out the candle and stepped into the night. He had 2 weeks to break an empire. Time to get started. The Briggs Ranch sat 4 miles east of Cold Creek, but it might as well have been on another planet. Where the town felt compressed and hollow, the ranch sprawled across a valley that still remembered what green looked like. Cottonwoods lined a creek that actually held water, and the grass, though beaten down by drought and harder times, still had some fight left in it. Ronan rode out at first light, before the town fully woke, and before Cain's men could organize whatever welcome they'd planned. Mrs. Chen had been up anyway, pressing coffee and biscuits on him with the kind of insistence that didn't invite argument. "The Briggs place used to employ half this town," she'd said, wrapping the biscuits in cloth. "Before Vane started squeezing. Now it's just Eliza and 2 ranch hands too loyal or too stubborn to leave." "What happened to the rest?" "Same thing that happens to everyone who crosses Vane. Accidents, fires, jobs that suddenly dry up." She'd looked at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "You hurt Cain yesterday. That makes you temporary. You go after Vane, that makes you dead." "Appreciate the encouragement." "I'm not encouraging anything. I'm telling you how things are." She'd handed him the bundle. "But if you somehow manage to stay alive long enough to matter, there's more people in this town who'd help than you think. They're just waiting to see if you're real or if you're another false start." Now, riding up the long approach to the ranch house, Ronan could see what Vane wanted. The land was good, better than good. With proper investment, this valley could support cattle, crops, maybe even orchards if someone gave a damn about the future. But more than that, it was position. Control this ranch, and you controlled the water rights, the main road east, and the moral high ground of being the valley's biggest landowner. In a place like Cold Creek, that meant you controlled everything. The ranch house was 2 stories of solid timber that had weathered a generation of storms without bending. Outbuildings clustered around it like chicks around a hen, barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, a workshop that looked like it still saw regular use. Horses moved in a corral, and he could see a vegetable garden that someone was fighting to keep alive despite the drought. Eliza emerged from the barn before he'd even dismounted, a rifle cradled in her arms with the casual comfort of someone who'd been carrying guns since childhood. She wasn't pointing it at him, but she wasn't exactly welcoming him either. "You're early," she said. "Didn't see the point in waiting." Most people would have slept on it, reconsidered, maybe decided this wasn't their fight after all. Ronan swung down from his horse, his back protesting the movement. 20 years ago, he could ride all day without feeling it. Now, every mile had a price. "I don't reconsider much. Waste of time." A man emerged from the barn behind Eliza, maybe 50, built like a fence post, with the kind of sun-weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. He had a pitchfork in his hands and the careful stillness of someone assessing threat. "That's Jack," Eliza said. "He's been with my family since I was 10. Jack nodded, didn't offer to shake hands. "You the one who put Marcus Kane on his ass yesterday?" "Didn't put him on his ass, just dislocated his elbow." "Close enough." Something that might have been a smile touched Jack's face. "Been waiting years for someone to do that." A younger man appeared from around the house. Early 20s, nervous energy, hand hovering near a gun he clearly didn't know how to use properly. "That's Tommy," Eliza said. "He's learning." "Learning what?" Ronan asked. "Everything," Tommy said, defensive. "How to work a ranch, how to fight back, how to not get killed by men like Vane." "How's that going?" "Still alive, aren't I?" Eliza cut in before the conversation could spiral. "Come inside, we need to talk strategy, and I'd rather not do it where Vane's scouts can see." The interior of the ranch house was cleaner than Ronan expected. Not fancy, but maintained with the kind of care that spoke to pride despite circumstances. Family photos lined the walls, tracking generations of Briggs, from daguerreotype formality to recent snapshots. In all of them, there was something in the eyes, a particular brand of stubbornness that looked like it ran in the blood. Eliza led him to a dining room table covered in papers, maps, legal documents, ledgers, newspaper clippings, the physical manifestation of her year-long investigation into Vane's operations. "This is everything I've got," she said, spreading it out. The pattern started 3 years ago, right after Vane arrived in Cold Creek. He came from back east, claimed he was investing in the frontier, bringing civilization and prosperity. "Let me guess," Ronan said. "He brought lawyers instead. Lawyers, bankers, men with badges and no conscience." She pulled out a map of the valley. "He started with the Anderson family, bought their debt from the bank, then foreclosed when they couldn't pay. Legal, clean, by the book. The Andersons packed up and left." Jack had followed them in, leaning against the doorframe. That was the test case. Vane wanted to see if anyone would fight back. And nobody did? The Andersons were old, tired. They took what little Vane offered and disappeared. Eliza traced a line on the map. Then he went after the Johnsons, the Wakefields, the Chen family's restaurant. Mrs. Chen's son ran it before Vane burned it down. Burned it? Accidentally, according to the investigation. Faulty stove. Happens all the time. Her voice dripped acid. Except Mrs. Chen's son swears someone broke in the night before. No proof, of course. Never is. Ronan studied the map. 14 properties marked in red, all clustered around the valley's best land and water access. The Briggs Ranch sat at the center, the keystone holding the arch. Take it, and everything else became easier to control. "Vane doesn't just want your land," he said slowly. "He wants the whole valley. Your ranch is the last piece that matters." "That's what I've been trying to tell people for a year." Eliza pulled out another document, a contract thick with legal language. "My father signed this 2 years ago. It was supposed to be a simple loan to get through a bad season, $1,500 at reasonable interest." Let me guess. The interest wasn't reasonable. The interest was criminal. Buried in Clause 47, subsection C, there's a provision that doubles the rate if payment is even 1 day late. And the payment schedule requires funds to arrive at the bank by noon on the 1st of each month. But the bank's only open from 2 to 4 on the 1st, because Vane changed the hours after my father signed. Ronan whistled low. That's elegant, in a completely bastard kind of way. It gets better. The contract also includes a clause allowing Vane's company to take possession of the property if the debt isn't cleared within 24 months. That deadline is in 2 weeks. She sat down hard, like the weight of it had finally caught up with her. "I've been paying what I can, when I can, but the interest keeps compounding, and Vane keeps finding reasons to add fees. Right now we owe $12,000 on a loan that started at $1,500. Jack pushed off from the doorframe. "We've tried going to other banks. They won't touch us. Tried lawyers. The good ones won't take the case. The bad ones are on Vane's payroll. Tried the territorial governor's office. They sent back a letter saying it was a local matter." "Of course they did." Ronan pulled the contract closer, scanning the dense text. "Who drew this up?" "Firm called Blackwell and Associates, out of Denver." "Never heard of them. Neither had we. Turns out they're a shell company. Vane owns them." Ronan sat back, processing. This wasn't just land grabbing. This was systematic destruction dressed up as capitalism. Vane had built a machine that ate families and shit out legal paperwork, and he'd done it in a way that made fighting back almost impossible. Almost. What about the town? Ronan asked. Sheriff, mayor, anyone with actual authority? Eliza laughed, ugly and sharp. Sheriff Dobbs is 73 and hasn't left his house in 6 months. Stroke, officially. Cowardice, realistically. The mayor is a man named Horace Griggs, who owns the general store. Vane bought his debt last year. Now Griggs does whatever Vane says and pretends it's civic duty. Deputy Kane's the real law, Jack added. And Kane's law is whatever keeps Vane happy. Tommy had been quiet, but now he spoke up from the corner where he'd been nervously cleaning a rifle. What about the federal marshal? Can't we get someone from outside? Already tried, Eliza said. Sent 3 letters. Got 1 response saying they'd look into it. That was 4 months ago. Ronan stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the valley stretched away in all directions. Beautiful, brutal, worth fighting for. He could see why Eliza's family had put roots down here, but he could also see why Vane wanted it. Land like this, in the right hands, was an empire waiting to happen. Tell me about Vane's operation, he said. How many men does he have? Eliza joined him at the window. Hard to say exactly. Kane and his deputies, 8 of them, all loyal because Vane pays better than honest work. Then there's the ranch hands at Vane's spread, maybe another dozen, plus the men who drift in and out, enforcers, collectors, the kind who do wet work for cash and don't ask questions. So we're looking at 30, give or take. 30 who'll fight, but that's not counting the people in town who'll look the other way, or the ones who'll actively help because they're scared or bought. She turned to face him. You can't shoot your way through this, Mr. Hale. There's too many of them and not enough of you. I wasn't planning to shoot anyone if I could avoid it, Jack snorted. Already dislocated Kane's elbow. That ship sailed. That was self-defense. What I'm talking about is different. Ronan moved to the table, studying the papers with fresh eyes. Vane's power comes from 3 things: money, fear, and legitimacy. He's rich, he's got guns, and he's got paperwork that makes it all look legal. We need to take away all 3. How? Tommy asked, eager despite his nerves. Step by step, piece by piece. Ronan started organizing the documents into piles. First, we need to understand his operation better. Where's the money actually coming from? He's buying up land, but land doesn't generate income fast enough to fund what he's doing. Eliza pulled out a ledger. I've been tracking that. Vane owns the bank, the land company, and a freight business that's got a contract to supply the mining camps 50 miles north. The freight business is the cash engine. He's charging triple what the old operators did, and the miners don't have a choice. So if the freight business stops making money, Vane has to sell assets or borrow money himself. And if he's borrowing, he's vulnerable. Ronan nodded slowly. What else? He's got investments in cattle, timber, and there's rumors about a railroad spur that might come through the valley. If that happens, this land goes from worth something to worth a fortune. When's the railroad decision? 6 months? Maybe a year? Then that's his timeline. He needs control of the valley before the railroad announces, or he loses the leverage. Ronan tapped the map. That's why he's pushing so hard right now. It's not just about your ranch. It's about locking down everything before the opportunity passes. Jack had been listening quietly, but now he leaned forward. So what's the plan? We can't outgun him, can't outlawyer him, and we sure as hell can't outweight him. No, but we can outthink him. Ronan pulled out a piece of paper, started sketching. Vane's operation is a web. Each piece connects to and supports the others. The bank funds the land grab. The land grab creates leverage. The leverage feeds the freight business. The freight business generates cash. It's circular, self-reinforcing. So circles break if you remove enough connection points. We don't need to destroy everything at once. We just need to create enough chaos that the system stops functioning efficiently. Eliza was catching on. You want to sabotage his businesses. I want to make them unprofitable. There's a difference. Ronan marked points on his sketch. The freight contract with the mines? What if those shipments started arriving late, or damaged, or not at all? The miners would cancel the contract, Tommy said, and Vane loses his main cash source. Then what happens? He has to liquidate something to cover operating costs, Eliza said slowly, which means selling property or calling in debts early or making mistakes because he's scrambling instead of controlling. Ronan looked up. That's when we hit him with the legal pressure. Not before. when he's got resources to fight back. After, when he's already bleeding and can't afford another wound. Jack was nodding now, seeing it. You're talking about a campaign, not a battle. Exactly. Multiple fronts, sustained pressure, always keeping him reactive. Ronan turned to Eliza. How much of his operation have you actually documented? Most of it. Enough to prove fraud if anyone bothered to look. Then we make them look. But first, we make sure Vane's too distracted to cover his tracks properly. Ronan checked the calendar on the wall. 2 weeks until your deadline. That's not much time. It's all we've got. Then we'd better not waste it. Ronan started gathering up the most critical documents. I'll need copies of everything. The contracts, the ledgers, the witness statements. And I'll need to talk to people in town quietly, without Vane knowing. That'll be dangerous, Jack warned. Vane's got eyes everywhere. Good. Let him watch. I want him nervous. Ronan met each of their eyes in turn. But I need you all to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Vane's going to push back hard, probably violently. People might get hurt. Are you ready for that? Tommy spoke first, his voice cracking slightly but determined. I'm ready. Jack just nodded, solid as the fence posts he resembled. Eliza held Ronan's gaze for a long moment. I've been ready for a year. The question is whether you're ready to finish what we're starting. I didn't ride 400 miles to quit halfway. Good. She extended her hand. Then we have a deal. They shook on it, her grip strong and calloused from ranch work. It felt like signing a contract more binding than anything Vane's lawyers could draft. A promise made in the morning light of a dying ranch, witnessed by two men who'd decided hope was worth more than safety. Outside, a hawk screamed as it dove for prey. The sound echoed across the valley like a warning or maybe a promise. Hard to tell which. The next 3 days were a blur of careful planning and quiet movement. Ronan spent his nights at Mrs. Chen's boarding house and his days learning everything he could about Vane's operation. He didn't move openly. That would have invited confrontation before he was ready. Instead, he watched, listened, and slowly began to piece together the shape of the enemy. Vane himself was a ghost. Nobody saw him much. He worked from a compound north of town, surrounded by guards and gates and the kind of security that suggested paranoia or guilt or both. The day-to-day operations ran through Kane and a man named Luther Finch, who served as Vane's business manager and chief enforcer of the subtle kind. Finch was interesting. Where Kane was all brute force and intimidation, Finch was smooth, educated, the kind of man who could foreclose on your property while making you feel grateful for the opportunity. He'd been a lawyer before coming west, according to Mrs. Chen, and he'd left Boston under circumstances nobody wanted to detail. He's worse than Kane, Mrs. Chen said one morning, serving Ronan eggs that were probably more valuable than gold in Cold Creek. Kane you can see coming. Finch smiles while he cuts your throat. Ronan filed that information away. Every organization had pressure points. The trick was finding them before they found you. On the second day, he made contact with some of the displaced families. Not all of them had left Cold Creek entirely. Some had moved to smaller plots or taken jobs in town, or were just too broke to afford leaving. They were bitter, angry, and scared, but they were also willing to talk once they understood Ronan wasn't with Vane. The pattern was always the same. Debt, deadline, default, dispossession. Vane's machine grinding forward with legal precision, leaving broken families in its wake. But in the details, Ronan found something useful: inconsistencies. The dates didn't always line up. The amounts changed between verbal agreements and written contracts. The witnesses to signings sometimes disappeared before they could testify to coercion. It wasn't enough to overturn anything in court, but it was enough to establish a pattern. And patterns, once exposed, became weapons. On the third day, Ronan made his first overt move. The freight depot sat on the southern edge of town, a sprawling complex of warehouses and loading docks where Vane's operation moved goods to and from the mining camps. It ran like clockwork, wagons in, wagons out, money flowing in a steady stream that funded everything else. Ronan didn't try to sneak in. Instead, he walked up to the front gate at noon when the sun was high and witnesses were plentiful, and asked to speak to the manager. The guard at the gate was one of Kane's men, recognizable by the way he wore his gun and his attitude. Depots closed to visitors. I'm not visiting. I'm applying for work. The guard squinted at him. You're the one who hurt Marcus. Marcus hurt himself. I just helped the process along. Boss ain't gonna hire you. Boss doesn't have to know. I'm talking to whoever runs the freight operations, not Vane himself. The guard considered this, probably running through the limited decision tree his job allowed. Finally, he jerked his thumb toward a building. Wait in there. Don't touch nothing. The office was small, cramped, filled with the smell of old paper and fresh sweat. Ronan waited, studying the operation through the window. 15 wagons visible, maybe more in the back. 20 or 30 workers, moving with the rhythm of routine. Security was light. 2 guards that he could see, probably more inside. The man who eventually entered was tall, thin, wearing a suit that might have been impressive in a city, but looked ridiculous in a freight depot. Luther Finch. Mr. Hale. Finch's voice was smooth, cultured, completely at odds with his surroundings. I'd say it's a pleasure, but we both know that would be a lie. Mr. Finch. I understand you're looking for employment. Interesting choice, given that you've made an enemy of my employer. Ronan shrugged. Man's gotta eat. Figured you might appreciate someone who knows which end of a gun to hold. We have plenty of people who know which end of a gun to hold. What we don't need is trouble, and you, Mr. Hale, are walking trouble. Finch sat on the edge of the desk, casual but calculating. So, let me be direct. What are you really doing here? Looking for work. Lie better or don't lie at all. You're working with the Briggs girl. Everyone knows it. The question is what you hope to accomplish. Maybe I hope to keep an innocent family from losing everything. Finch smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Ronan's hand itch toward his gun. There are no innocent families in Cold Creek, Mr. Hale. There are only people who sign contracts and people who don't. The Briggs family signed. They agreed to terms. Now those terms are coming due. Terms you manipulated. Terms we offered, and they accepted. If they lacked the business acumen to understand what they were signing, that's unfortunate but not illegal. It's fraud. Prove it. Finch stood, brushing dust from his suit. You're welcome to try, of course. Take your evidence to a judge, file your complaints, make your case. But I should warn you, Mr. Vane has excellent attorneys, and they have a perfect record in this jurisdiction. Jurisdiction changes when you cross certain lines. Does it? Finch moved to the window, looking out at the freight operation. Because from where I stand, everything we've done is perfectly legal. Aggressive, perhaps. Ruthless, certainly. But legal. And in this country, legal is all that matters. Ronan joined him at the window. You really believe that? I believe that law is the only thing separating civilization from chaos. Mr. Vane understands this. He operates within the law, uses it to his advantage, bends it when possible, but never breaks it. That's why he'll win, Mr. Hale. Not because he's stronger or meaner, but because he's smarter. Smart men make mistakes. Not this one. Finch turned to face him. Let me save you some time and pain. Leave Cold Creek. There's nothing here for you except an early grave. The Briggs Ranch will change hands in 2 weeks. The valley will continue to prosper under Mr. Vane's stewardship, and life will go on. Your interference changes nothing except how many people get hurt in the process. You're awful confident. I'm awful experienced. I've seen men like you before, self-righteous, stubborn, convinced they're fighting for something that matters. They all end the same way. He walked to the door, opened it. This conversation is over. You're trespassing on private property. Leave now, or I'll have you removed. Ronan didn't move immediately. He'd gotten what he came for, confirmation that Vane's people were watching, worried enough to engage directly, confident enough to be careless about it. I'll leave, but tell Vane something for me. What's that? Tell him I'm not going anywhere, and tell him every day he doesn't take me seriously is a day he loses ground. Finch's smile never wavered. I'll pass that along. I'm sure he'll find it amusing. Ronan walked out of the depot with every eye on him, every guard tense and ready. He didn't hurry, didn't show fear, just moved with the same steady pace he'd entered with. But inside his mind was racing, cataloging details, counting weaknesses, building a plan. The freight operation was the key. Disrupt it enough, and Vane's cash flow dried up. Create enough problems, and those mining contracts would start looking elsewhere. Make it too expensive to maintain, and the whole enterprise collapsed. But he needed help. One man couldn't sabotage an operation that size without getting caught or killed. He needed people, resources, and most importantly, He needed to move fast. That night, he met with Eliza and Jack at a spot 2 miles from the ranch, where the creek ran through a stand of cottonwoods that provided cover from casual observation. Tommy was there too, nervous but learning to hide it better. "Finch knows I'm working with you," Ronan said without preamble, "which means Vane knows. They're watching." "Expected," Eliza said. "What did you learn?" "The freight depot's vulnerable. Security is lighter than it should be, and the operation runs on routine. Break the routine and you break the efficiency." "How?" Ronan pulled out a rough sketch he'd made. "The wagons run on a schedule, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, to the mining camps. They load the day before, overnight in the depot, roll out at dawn. If those wagons don't make their schedule, the mines don't get supplies. If the mines don't get supplies, they complain to Vane. If Vane can't deliver, they find someone who can." Jack studied the sketch. "You want to hit the wagons?" "I want to make hitting the wagons look like bad luck. Broken axles, spoiled food, missing inventory. Nothing obvious, nothing traceable, just a steady stream of problems that make the operation unreliable." "That'll take time," Tommy said. "We've only got 2 weeks." "We don't need to destroy the freight business in 2 weeks. We just need to damage Vane's reputation enough that cracks start showing." Ronan looked at each of them. "But it's risky. If we get caught, Vane will use it as justification for whatever he wants to do." Eliza was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. Finally, she nodded. "Do it. But carefully. We can't afford mistakes." Over the next week, they put the plan into motion. It started small, a wagon wheel that developed a crack overnight, forcing a delay. Shipment of flour that got wet during a freak rainstorm that only seemed to hit the depot. A horse that came up lame for no obvious reason, right before a scheduled departure. Individually, none of it was suspicious. Collectively, it was a pattern that made Vane's operation look incompetent. Ronan handled most of the sabotage himself, moving in the hours before dawn when guards were sleepy and routines were predictable. Jack helped, using his knowledge of ranch equipment to make failures look natural. Tommy served as lookout, learning fieldcraft the hard way, by doing it when mistakes meant death. Eliza coordinated, tracking results, adjusting strategy, keeping everyone focused on the larger goal. She was good at it, Ronan realized, better than good. She had the kind of tactical mind that could see 3 moves ahead and adjust when the board changed. By the end of the first week, the mining camps were complaining. Ronan heard about it from Mrs. Chen, who heard it from travelers passing through. Vane's freight operation was getting unreliable. Shipments were late, damaged, incomplete. The mines were threatening to take their business elsewhere. Finch showed up at Mrs. Chen's boarding house on the 8th day. Ronan was in his room when he heard the knock, not on his door, but on the front entrance. Through the thin walls, he could hear the conversation. "Is Mr. Hale available?" Mrs. Chen's voice, flat and unimpressed. "Don't know. You got a warrant?" "I'm not here in an official capacity. I'd simply like to speak with him." "About what?" "A business proposition." Ronan came downstairs, not because he wanted to, but because avoiding Finch would signal fear. The lawyer stood in Mrs. Chen's parlor, looking even more out of place than usual, surrounded by doilies and faded photographs. "Mr. Hale, thank you for seeing me." "Didn't say I was seeing you, said I was coming downstairs." Finch's smile was patient. "Semantics. May we speak privately? Anything you've got to say you can say in front of Mrs. Chen." "Very well." Finch pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Mr. Vane would like to make you an offer, $500 paid in cash, in exchange for your immediate departure from Cold Creek." Ronan didn't reach for the envelope. "That's it? That's the offer?" "Given current circumstances, it's quite generous." "Current circumstances being that your freight operation's falling apart." Finch's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The freight operation is experiencing routine difficulties, nothing that can't be resolved." "Funny how those difficulties started right around when I showed up." "Correlation isn't causation, Mr. Hale, though I admit the timing is unfortunate." Finch set the envelope on a side table. "The offer stands for 24 hours. After that, Mr. Vane will be forced to take other measures." "What kind of measures?" "The kind that don't involve envelopes." Finch moved to the door. "You're a capable man, Mr. Hale, capable enough to recognize when you're outmatched. Take the money, right away, let Cold Creek solve its own problems. And if I don't?" Finch paused in the doorway. "Then we'll solve them for you." After he left, Mrs. Chen picked up the envelope, weighed it thoughtfully. That's a lot of money. It is. You going to take it? What do you think? She handed him the envelope. I think you're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. Haven't decided which yet. Ronan opened the envelope. $500, exactly as promised. New bills, sequential serial numbers, probably untraceable but definitely real. It was more money than most people in Cold Creek saw in a year. He thought about what he could do with it. Leave. Start over somewhere else. Let this town and its problems fade in his rearview mirror. He'd done it before. Walked away from fights that weren't his, places that didn't want saving. But then he thought about Eliza's face when she'd handed him that journal. The year of work, the careful documentation, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would care enough to help. He thought about the families he'd talked to, the ones who'd lost everything because Vane's lawyers were better than their honor. He thought about Tommy, young and scared but still showing up every day because someone had to. And he thought about what he'd told himself a long time ago, after the war, when the killing was done and the world hadn't magically become a better place just because the fighting stopped. He'd promised himself that if he ever got the chance to actually fix something, instead of just breaking it, he'd take it. This was that chance. Ronan walked to Mrs. Chen's fireplace, struck a match, and set the envelope on fire. They watched it burn together, $500 turning to ash and smoke. Stupid it is, Mrs. Chen said finally. Probably. You got a plan for when Vane stops offering money and starts offering bullets? Working on it, she snorted. Work faster, because that man doesn't make empty threats, and you just told him you're not scared. Good. I want him to know. That night, Ronan met with the others again. The deadline was 6 days away now, close enough to taste, far enough that panic hadn't set in yet. They gathered in the barn at the Briggs Ranch, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and honest work. Vane made me an offer today, Ronan said. 500 cash to leave town. Tommy's eyes went wide. That's a lot of money, Eliza finished, which means we're hurting him. He wouldn't offer that if we weren't. I turned it down. Obviously. Jack was cleaning a rifle, the kind of maintenance work that kept hands busy while minds worked. Which means he'll escalate. He will. Probably soon. Ronan laid out the latest version of their plan, refined by a week of trial and error. We've made the freight operation unreliable. Now we need to hit the money directly. The bank? Tommy asked. Not rob it. Expose it. Ronan pulled out some of the documents Eliza had gathered. Vane's bank has been offering loans at predatory rates, then using those loans to acquire property. But banks have regulations, oversight, requirements. If we can prove he's violating banking law, we can get federal investigators involved. Eliza leaned forward. How? By getting someone inside. Someone who can copy records, document practices, provide first-hand testimony about illegal operations. Who? Ronan looked at Tommy. Someone young, inexperienced, looking for honest work at the bank. Someone they wouldn't suspect. Tommy went pale. Me? You're the only one who fits. Jack's too old, Eliza's too connected to the ranch, and I'm too obvious. I can't. Tommy was stammering, fear winning over courage. I'm not a spy. You don't have to be James Bond, Jack said gruffly. You just have to keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. And if they catch me? They won't, Ronan said with more confidence than he felt. Because you're not going to steal anything. You're not going to sneak around. You're just going to do your job and pay attention. Notice which files go where, which customers get special treatment, which deals happen off the books. Eliza put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. I wouldn't ask this if there was another way. But we're running out of time and we need leverage. Tommy looked at each of them, young and terrified and trying so hard to be brave it hurt to watch. Finally, he nodded. Okay, I'll do it. But if I die, I'm coming back to haunt all of you. Fair enough, Ronan said. The next morning, Tommy applied for work at Vane's bank. The position was real. They needed a clerk, someone to handle paperwork and run errands. The pay was decent, the work was easy, and Tommy sold the lie beautifully. Young man looking to move up in the world, tired of ranch work, eager to learn the banking business. They hired him on the spot, For 3 days, Tommy worked at the bank, and for 3 nights, he reported back everything he saw. The books didn't add up. Loans were issued without proper documentation. Foreclosures happened faster than the law allowed. And most importantly, there was a second set of books, real numbers kept in a safe that only Finch had access to. "If we could get those books," Eliza said on the 4th night, "we'd have everything we need to prove fraud." "We can't break into a bank," Jack said flatly. "That's how you get shot and go to prison, in that order." "We don't have to break in," Ronan said slowly. An idea was forming, dangerous and stupid and just crazy enough to work. "We just need to give them a reason to bring those books out." "How?" "By making them think they're about to lose everything." The plan was insane. Everyone agreed on that point. But it was also the only play they had left, with the deadline now 4 days away and Vane circling like a shark that smelled blood. They spent a full day preparing, gathering materials, coordinating timing, running through contingencies until everyone could execute their part blind. Jack was skeptical, Eliza was nervous, and Tommy looked like he might throw up. But they all showed up when the time came, because that's what people did when the alternatives were surrender or annihilation. They chose to fight. The fire started at 2 in the morning, 3 days before the deadline. Not at the bank. That would have been too obvious, too direct. Instead, it bloomed to life in the freight depot's main warehouse, right where Vane stored his most valuable inventory bound for the mining camps. Flour, tools, blasting powder, medical supplies, everything the mines needed and paid premium prices for. Ronan watched from a quarter-mile away as orange light painted the night sky. He wasn't the one who'd said it, hadn't even suggested it directly. That had been Jack's idea, born from 40 years of knowing how buildings were put together and exactly where they came apart. "Lantern kicks over," Jack had explained 2 nights prior. "Happens all the time in warehouses. Oil spills, catches on the hay they use for packing, spreads faster than anyone can stop it. Tragic, expensive, but most importantly, not obviously arson." "You sure it'll work?" Tommy had asked. "I'm sure it'll burn. Whether it works depends on what happens next." What happened next was chaos. The volunteer fire brigade arrived first. 12 men with buckets and a water cart that might as well have been trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. The flames had already claimed half the warehouse by the time they started working, and the wind was up, pushing sparks toward the other buildings. Kane showed up 5 minutes later, screaming orders that nobody could hear over the roar of burning timber. His men formed a line, passing buckets, but it was clear to anyone watching that the warehouse was lost. The question was whether they could save the rest of the depot. Finch arrived 10 minutes after that, emerging from a carriage like he'd been roused from bed, which he probably had been. Even in the firelight, Ronan could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, adding up losses, weighing options, trying to figure out if this was accident or attack. And then, 45 minutes into the blaze, when half the town was watching and the depot was starting to look like it might survive after all, a second fire started. This one was at Vane's timber yard, 2 miles north. Ronan heard about it from a rider who came galloping past, shouting for more men, more water, more everything. The timber yard was bigger than the depot, held more value, and if it went up, it would burn for days. Finch had to choose, save the depot or save the timber yard. He couldn't do both with the resources available. He chose the timber yard. Ronan waited until most of Kane's men had left, chasing after Finch's carriage toward the new fire. Then he moved, slipping through the confusion like smoke, heading for the bank. The building was dark, locked, supposedly secure, but supposedly was doing a lot of work in that sentence because Tommy had spent 3 days making sure one of the back windows wouldn't quite latch properly. Nothing obvious, just a catch that didn't catch, a lock that looked engaged but wasn't. Ronan had the window open in 30 seconds. Inside, the bank smelled like paper and ink and the particular staleness of money that had been handled too many times. He didn't light a lamp. The glow from the fires provided enough illumination through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The safe was in Finch's office, exactly where Tommy said it would be. A diebold, commercial grade, the kind that would take an expert an hour to crack under ideal conditions. Ronan wasn't an expert, and conditions were far from ideal. But he didn't need to crack it. He needed Finch to open it for him. Ronan pulled out the papers he'd prepared. Perfect forgeries of federal banking documents, complete with official seals he'd bought from a forger in Denver 3 years back. They announced an emergency audit of Vane's bank, effective immediately, citing irregularities in lending practices and potential violations of territorial banking law. The documents were complete fiction, but they looked real enough to panic someone who had something to hide. He laid them out on Finch's desk, weighted down with a paperweight, positioned so they'd be the first thing visible when someone entered the office. Then he scattered a few more papers around, withdrawal forms, loan applications, just enough to make it look like someone had been rifling through files. The final touch was a ledger, left open to a page showing one of Vane's more questionable transactions. Not the smoking gun, but enough smoke to make anyone nervous. Ronan was out the window and gone before the first of Kane's men returned to check on the bank. He watched from across the street, hidden in the shadow of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, as the guard noticed the open window. Watched as the man drew his gun and went inside. Watched as, 3 minutes later, the guard came running back out and rode off at a gallop. Going to get Finch. The lawyer arrived 20 minutes later, still smelling like smoke from the timber yard. He went inside with 2 guards, and through the window, Ronan could see the exact moment Finch spotted the documents. The man went rigid, leaned closer, then grabbed the papers and read them with the kind of focus that meant terror was starting to set in. Finch barked orders at the guards. They left. He started pacing, reading the documents again, checking dates, probably trying to figure out if they were real or if this was some elaborate trick. Then he did exactly what Ronan hoped he'd do. He went to the safe. Ronan couldn't see what Finch was doing from this angle, but he didn't need to. Tommy had installed a small mirror in the office 3 days ago, positioned on a shelf in a way that looked decorative but actually reflected the safe's dial. Ronan had someone watching that reflection. Eliza was in the building next door, in a rented room that gave her a perfect sight line through the bank's window. She had a notebook, a pencil, and instructions to write down every number Finch's hand touched on that dial. The combination. Finch worked the safe for 90 seconds, and then it opened. He pulled out 3 ledgers, the real books, the ones that showed what was actually happening with Vane's money. He spread them on his desk, comparing entries to the fake federal documents, trying to determine how much trouble he was in. Ronan gave him 15 minutes, long enough to get thoroughly panicked, short enough that he wouldn't have time to hide everything before the next crisis hit. The next crisis hit right on schedule. A rider came pounding up to the bank, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. He ran inside, and Ronan could hear the shouting even from across the street. The timber yard was lost, completely gone, and the fire had spread to a nearby equipment shed that held blasting powder. The shed exploded 6 seconds later. Ronan felt the concussion from a quarter-mile away, a deep thump that rattled windows and set dogs barking across town. A column of flames shot into the sky, followed by a mushroom of smoke that looked apocalyptic in the pre-dawn darkness. Finch came running out of the bank, leaving everything behind: the fake documents, the open safe, the real ledgers spread across his desk. He jumped in his carriage and whipped the horses toward the explosion, probably imagining the entire operation burning to ash. As soon as he was gone, Ronan moved. He was back through the window in seconds, straight to Finch's office. The ledgers were there, just as he'd hoped. 3 volumes of careful accounting that showed every dirty deal, every manipulated loan, every piece of property acquired through fraud. He couldn't take them. That would be too obvious, would confirm this was a robbery rather than an audit scare. Instead, he did something more subtle. He photographed them. The camera was a small portable model, the kind journalists used, loaded with film Tommy had stolen from the general store. Ronan worked fast, flipping pages, shooting images, trying to capture every relevant entry. The light was terrible, his hands were shaking from adrenaline, and he was absolutely certain someone was going to walk in any second. But nobody did. He finished the first ledger, moved to the second. This one was worse. Details of threats, payments to Kane's men, notes about families who'd agreed to sell after their barns mysteriously burned or their livestock died. The third ledger was the crown jewel. Property transfers, dates, values, a complete map of Vane's land grab with notes in Finch's precise handwriting explaining exactly how each piece had been acquired. Ronan shot the last page just as he heard voices outside. He closed the ledgers, put them back exactly as Finch had left them, and was out the window 30 seconds before Kane walked in with 4 men to check on the bank's security. Ronan moved through the pre-dawn darkness, the camera tucked inside his coat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, Cold Creek was burning in 3 different locations, and Vane's entire operation was scrambling to contain damage. But the real damage was already done. It was just waiting to be developed. He made it back to Mrs. Chen's, slipped in through the back door, and climbed the stairs to his room. Eliza was waiting there, along with Jack. Tommy was still at his boarding house, maintaining his cover. "You get it?" Jack asked. Ronan set the camera on the table. 3 ledgers, maybe 200 pages. Won't know if the photos are usable until we develop them. "I got the combination," Eliza said, showing her notebook. The numbers were written in neat columns, timestamps next to each one, showing when Finch had touched each digit. "Good. We'll need it." Ronan moved to the window, watching the orange glow on the horizon. "How bad is the damage?" "Depot warehouse is gone," Jack reported. "Timber yard is gone. Equipment shed is gone. The explosions took out some of the surrounding structures, too. I'm hearing estimates of 50,000 in losses, maybe more." Ronan whistled low. "That'll hurt." "It'll do more than hurt. That's cash money, inventory, infrastructure. Vane's going to feel this for months. Assuming he survives it," Eliza added. She looked tired, soot-stained from her position watching the fires. "The mines are already talking about canceling their contracts. Word is spreading that Vane can't protect his assets, can't maintain his supply lines." "Good. Let it spread." Ronan pulled the curtains closed. "But this is where it gets dangerous. We just hit Vane harder than anyone's hit him since he arrived. He's going to respond." "How?" Jack asked. "Hard, fast, and probably violent. He can't let this stand without losing face, losing control." Ronan started pacing, thinking through scenarios. Best case, he comes after me directly, tries to run me out of town or put me in the ground. And worst case, he goes after the ranch, burns you out, kills anyone who resists, and claims it was retaliation for sabotage. Eliza's face went hard. "Let him try. I'd rather not let him try anything. We need to keep him off balance, keep him reacting instead of planning." Ronan turned to Jack. "How fast can you get those photos developed?" "I know a guy in the next town over, photographer, does work for newspapers. He owes me. I can have prints by tomorrow night if I leave now." "Do it. And make copies. 3 sets minimum. We need backups in case something happens to the originals." Jack nodded, taking the camera. "What about you?" "I'm going to make sure Vane knows exactly who's responsible for tonight." "That's suicide," Eliza said. "Maybe, but it's also the only way to make sure he focuses on me instead of you." Ronan checked his gun, reloaded it from habit more than necessity. "If I'm the target, you're safe. If you're the target, we've already lost." "I don't need protecting." "I know, but the ranch does, and the evidence does. And right now those are more important than either of our egos." She didn't like it, but she couldn't argue with the logic. "What's the plan?" "I'm going to visit Vane, personally, at his compound." "That's insane," Jack said flatly. "Probably, but he's already going to assume I'm behind tonight. Better to confirm it and set terms than let him imagine worse and respond to his imagination." "What terms?" "Simple. He leaves the ranch alone. I don't release the photos to every newspaper and federal marshal between here and Washington." Eliza shook her head. "He'll never agree to that." "Doesn't have to agree. He just has to understand the threat is real." Ronan moved toward the door. "Get those photos developed. Stay at the ranch. Keep your heads down. And if anything happens to me, take the evidence and run. Don't try to be heroes." "Ronan." "I mean it, Eliza. If this goes wrong, the only thing that matters is getting those ledgers in front of someone who can actually do something about them. Promise me." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Fine. I promise. But you better come back." "Working on it." He left before she could argue further, stepping out into a town that smelled like smoke and fear. The fires were mostly contained now, reduced to glowing embers and occasional flare-ups. People were returning to their homes, exhausted, blackened with soot, talking in the hushed tones of those who'd just survived something they didn't fully understand. Ronan saddled his horse and rode north, toward Vane's compound. The estate sat on a rise overlooking the valley, 5 miles from town. Vane had built it like a fortress. High walls, iron gates, guards with rifles. It screamed insecurity dressed up as wealth, the kind of place that told you everything you needed to know about the man inside. Ronan approached openly, making no attempt at stealth. The guards saw him coming from a mile away, and by the time he reached the gates, 6 rifles were pointed at his chest. "I'm here to see Silas Vane," he called out. "Mr. Vane isn't receiving visitors," the lead guard said. He was in his 40s, professional, the kind of hired gun who did things by the book because books kept you alive longer. "He'll want to receive this one. Tell him Ronan Hale is here to discuss tonight's fires." The guard's eyes narrowed. "You admitting to arson?" "I'm admitting to being someone Mr. Vane needs to talk to. You want to be the one who turned me away, that's your call. But when your boss asks why you didn't let him know I was here, you're going to have a real uncomfortable conversation." The guard considered this, probably running through the same risk-reward calculation Ronan was counting on. Finally, he jerked his head at one of the others. "Get Mr. Finch." They waited in silence, guns still trained on Ronan, while the messenger ran toward the main house. 5 minutes later, Finch appeared, looking even more haggard than he had at the bank. His suit was rumpled, his face smudged with ash, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting fires, both literal and metaphorical. "Mr. Hale." Finch's voice was flat, emotionless. "I should have you shot where you stand. You could try, but then you'd never know what I know, or who I've told, or what arrangements I've made if something happens to me. You're bluffing." "Am I? You want to bet your entire operation on that guess?" Ronan leaned forward in his saddle. "Let me in, or spend the rest of your life wondering what evidence is sitting in a lawyer's office somewhere, ready to be mailed to the territorial governor if I miss my weekly check-in." Finch stared at him for a long time. Then, against what was probably every instinct screaming in his head, he opened the gate. "You have 10 minutes, Finch said as Ronan dismounted. "And if you try anything, my men will kill you slowly." "Fair enough." They walked through grounds that were immaculate despite the late hour. Manicured lawns, imported trees, gravel paths that probably cost more than most houses in Cold Creek. The main house was 3 stories of Victorian excess, all gables and balconies and windows that caught the first light of dawn. Silas Vane was waiting in a study that looked like it had been transplanted whole from a Boston mansion. Dark wood, leather furniture, books that had never been read lining shelves that existed only for show. The man himself was smaller than Ronan expected, maybe 5'8", slender, wearing a smoking jacket like he was posing for a portrait. But his eyes were the tell. Cold, calculating, completely devoid of anything resembling human warmth. These were eyes that saw people as numbers, as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. "Mr. Hale." Vane's voice was surprisingly cultured, touched with an accent that suggested education and old money. "The man who's been causing me such difficulty." "Mr. Vane, the man who's been stealing this valley piece by piece." Vane smiled. "Stealing, such a crude word. I prefer acquiring through legitimate business practices. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night." "I sleep perfectly well, I assure you." Vane moved to a sideboard, poured himself a drink without offering one to Ronan. "So, you've burned down a significant portion of my operation, cost me considerable money, and generally made yourself a nuisance. The question is what you hope to accomplish." "I want you to leave the Briggs Ranch alone." "I'm afraid that's not possible. I have a legal claim to that property." "You have a fraudulent claim based on a manipulated contract." "Prove it." Vane sipped his drink. "In court. With lawyers and judges and all the tedious machinery of justice. I welcome the attempt. I don't need to prove it in court. I just need to prove it in newspapers." That got Vane's attention. His eyes sharpened, and for the first time Ronan saw something that might have been concern flicker across that perfect mask. "Explain. You've been very careful to keep your operations legal, or legal enough that no judge in your pocket would rule against you. But legality and morality aren't the same thing, and public opinion doesn't require a jury verdict." Ronan pulled a photograph from his pocket, one he'd held back from the batch Jack was developing. It showed a single page from Vane's ledger, clearly displaying a transaction where a family had been forced to sell for a fraction of value after mysterious accidents made their property untenable. Vane took the photograph, studied it. "Where did you get this?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is I have copies of every ledger in Finch's safe. Every transaction, every threat, every piece of property you've stolen. And if anything happens to the Briggs Ranch, or to me or to anyone I care about, those copies go to every newspaper between here and New York." "You're bluffing." Same thing Finch said. "You want to take that bet?" Ronan met Vane's eyes. You've built your empire on looking legitimate, on having the law on your side. What happens when everyone knows the truth? When the territorial governor gets questions from reporters? When the federal marshals start wondering why their office keeps getting letters about banking fraud in Cold Creek? Vane set down the photograph, his expression unreadable. Even if what you say is true, exposure would be inconvenient, but not fatal. I have resources, connections, lawyers who can make problems disappear. Maybe, but can they make problems disappear faster than I can create them? Because I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Vane. Every day you operate, I'll be watching. Every family you threaten, I'll document. Every law you bend, I'll report. You'll spend more time and money covering your tracks than you'll ever make from this valley. Then I'll simply remove you. You can try, but I'm one man. Kill me, and the evidence still exists. Kill me, and you confirm everything I've accused you of. Kill me, and you turn me into a martyr for every family you've destroyed. Ronan leaned forward. Right now, you have a choice. Walk away from the Briggs Ranch, cut your losses, and I stay quiet. Or push forward, and I make sure your name becomes synonymous with everything wrong with frontier capitalism. The room went silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantel. Vane studied Ronan the way a chess player studies a board, looking for the trap, the angle, the weakness that would let him turn this around. Finally, he spoke. You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Hale. I get that a lot. The Briggs property is worth a fortune. The railroad spur will run through that valley within a year, and whoever controls that land will control the entire region's development. You're asking me to walk away from millions. I'm telling you the cost of getting those millions. You want to pay it? That's your decision. Vane finished his drink, set the glass down with precise care. No. No? No, I will not walk away. The Briggs Ranch will be mine in 2 days, as legally contracted. You can release your photographs, send your letters, make all the noise you want. But I will not be intimidated by a drifter with delusions of heroism. Ronan had expected this, but hearing it still settled like lead in his gut. Then we're at war. We've been at war since you arrived. You were just too naive to realize it. Vane moved to the door, opened it. Guards appeared immediately. Mr. Hale is leaving. Escort him off the property. If he returns, shoot him. Ronan stood, made no sudden movements. This was your chance to end this quietly. I don't end things quietly, Mr. Hale. I end them completely. Vane's smile was colder than the dawn air. You have 48 hours before the Briggs property transfers to my ownership. I suggest you use that time to prepare your farewells. The guards moved in, hands on weapons. Ronan let them escort him out, down the gravel path, through the gates. They gave him back his horse and watched as he rode away, and he could feel their guns tracking him until he was out of range. He'd accomplished what he came for, but not in the way he'd hoped. Vane knew about the photographs now, knew Ronan had evidence, but instead of backing down, he doubled down, which meant the next 2 days were going to determine everything. Ronan rode back to Cold Creek as the sun climbed over the horizon, painting the smoke-stained valley in shades of gold and gray. The town was stirring, people emerging to assess the damage from the fires. The depot was a blackened shell. The timber yard was gone. And everywhere, there was the smell of burned money and shattered confidence. Mrs. Chen was on her porch when he arrived, sweeping ash that would just be replaced by more ash tomorrow. You still alive, she observed. Apparently. Vane let you walk out? For now. That man doesn't let people walk out unless he's got something worse planned. She stopped sweeping, looked at him directly. What did you do? Showed him evidence, made threats, drew a line. And he's going to cross it, probably today. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd been thinking. You need to get those folks out of the ranch, today, right now. They won't leave. Then they'll die there. Vane doesn't make idle threats any more than you do. She resumed sweeping, each stroke deliberate. I've seen this before, Mr. Hale. Different town, different men, same story. Someone stands up, someone gets killed, and everyone else learns to keep their heads down. That's how places like Cold Creek work. Not this time. Every time. You're one man with a camera and some papers. He's a man with an army and no conscience. The math doesn't work in your favor. Ronan wanted to argue, but he was too tired and she was too right. Instead, he said, if it goes wrong, if we lose, when you lose. If we lose, will you make sure the evidence gets out? There's copies at the ranch, more coming from Jack. Someone needs to... I'll make sure. Mrs. Chen stopped sweeping again, met his eyes. But not because I think it'll matter. Because I'm old and Chinese and I've survived this long by being useful to whoever's in charge. So yes, I'll keep your papers safe and I'll send them wherever you want. And in 20 years, maybe someone will care. But tonight, tomorrow, next week, nobody's coming to save you, Mr. Hale. You're on your own. I know. Good. At least you're not stupid. She went inside, leaving him on a porch covered in ash from fires he'd started, in a town that had stopped believing rescue was possible. Ronan stood there for a moment, feeling every one of his 40-some years. His back hurt, his hands were shaking from adrenaline crash, and his mind kept presenting him with scenarios that all ended with bodies and fire and failure. But then he thought about Eliza's journal, that year of careful documentation. He thought about the families he'd talked to, the ones who'd lost everything. He thought about Tommy, young and scared but showing up anyway, and he thought about what he'd told himself after the war, about fixing things instead of breaking them. This wasn't fixed yet, but maybe, just maybe, it could be. He rode out to the ranch, arriving just as Jack returned from delivering the film. They gathered in the barn, Ronan, Eliza, Jack, and Tommy, who'd been called back from his bank job now that subtlety was dead. Vane won't negotiate, Ronan said without preamble. He's coming for the ranch, probably within 24 hours. We need to be ready. Ready how? Tommy asked. We've got 4 people and a handful of rifles against Vane's entire operation. We've got more than that. We've got evidence, we've got the truth, and we've got the fact that Vane just lost a fortune in a single night. Ronan pulled out the map of the valley. He's wounded, angry, and making decisions from emotion instead of logic. That makes him predictable. Predictably violent, Jack muttered. Yes, but violence is the one language I speak fluently. Ronan started marking the map. The ranch has good position, high ground, clear sight lines, only 2 approaches that don't involve crossing open ground. If we fortify properly, we can hold against a force 3 times our size. For how long? Eliza asked. Long enough. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. Ronan looked at each of them. Jack's developing the photos, which should be done by tonight. Once we have those, we send copies to every authority we can think of, territorial governor, federal marshals, newspapers, anyone who might care. Then we hold this position until they respond. And if they don't respond? Tommy's voice was small. Then we gave it everything we had, and we don't have regrets. They spent the rest of the day preparing, boarding up windows, positioning rifles, stockpiling ammunition and supplies. Jack turned the ranch house into a fortress, using his carpenter's knowledge to reinforce weak points and create firing positions. Eliza inventoried everything they had: food, water, medical supplies, escape routes if everything went to hell. Tommy was assigned lookout duty, positioned in the barn's loft where he could see both approaches. He was scared. Anyone could see that. But he didn't complain, didn't ask to be elsewhere. He just took his rifle and climbed the ladder and watched the horizon like their lives depended on it, because they did. As the sun set on what might be their last day of freedom, Ronan stood on the porch and looked out over the valley. It was beautiful in a harsh way, the kind of beauty that didn't apologize for being difficult. The creek still ran, the grass still grew, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the world kept turning like none of this mattered. Eliza joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had been reheated so many times it tasted like dirt and determination. Think they'll come tonight? She asked. No, Vane's not a night fighter. He'll want everyone to see it, want the whole town to understand what happens when you cross him. Tomorrow then. Tomorrow. They drank their terrible coffee in silence, watching the light fade. Somewhere in town Vane was planning. Somewhere else, Kane was gathering men. And somewhere beyond all of it, forces were in motion that neither of them could control. Federal authorities who might respond, newspapers that might care, justice that might finally arrive. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, all that mattered was the ground they stood on and their willingness to defend it. You could still leave, Eliza said quietly. This isn't your ranch, isn't your fight. You've done more than anyone had a right to ask. I could, Ronan agreed, but I won't. Why? He thought about that for a long time, trying to find words for something that didn't fit cleanly into language. Because I spent 20 years breaking things. Thought I was good at it, thought it mattered. Then the war ended, and I realized I'd just been making noise while the world fell apart around me. He finished his coffee, set the cup down. This is my chance to build something instead. Even if it's just one ranch, one family, one small piece of ground, where people don't have to be afraid anymore. That's a lot of weight to put on a land dispute. Maybe, but weight's all I've got left to carry. They stood together as full dark claimed the valley, two people who'd found each other through desperation and were about to find out if desperation was enough to survive what came next. In the barn, Tommy called out a warning, riders on the horizon. But when Ronan grabbed his rifle and took position, he saw it wasn't Vane's men. It was the people of Cold Creek, 20 of them, maybe more, carrying lanterns and supplies, and the kind of grim determination that came from finally deciding enough was enough. Mrs. Chen led them, tiny and ancient and absolutely done with being afraid. "We're here to help," she said simply. And just like that, 4 defenders became 25. Ronan stared at the crowd gathering in the failing light, trying to process what he was seeing. These weren't fighters. Most of them looked like they'd never held a gun with intent to use it. The blacksmith from town, still wearing his leather apron. A woman who ran the dress shop, her hands more familiar with needles than triggers. The owner of the livery stable, 60 if he was a day. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her tiny frame somehow commanding attention. "We brought food, ammunition, whatever we could carry, and we brought ourselves." "This isn't your fight," Ronan said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. "The hell it isn't." That was the blacksmith, a man named Samuel who'd lost his shop to Vane's debt collectors 6 months prior. "We've been watching Vane destroy this town piece by piece while we did nothing. Yesterday you burned his operation to the ground and walked into his compound like you owned the place. Maybe you're crazy, maybe you're suicidal, but you're the first person who's actually fought back." "So we're here," Mrs. Chen said. "Because if you're going to make a stand, you shouldn't have to make it alone." Eliza appeared beside Ronan, and he could hear the emotion thick in her voice. "You could lose everything. Vane will come after anyone who helps us." "We've already lost everything," the dress shop owner said. Her name was Margaret, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from years of barely surviving. "Our businesses, our homes, our dignity. What's left to lose?" "Your lives," Ronan said bluntly. "This isn't going to be a protest or a petition. When Vane comes, he's going to come with guns, and people are going to die. You understand that?" The crowd exchanged looks, fear flickering across faces, but nobody moved to leave. "We understand," Samuel said finally. "But we're done being scared. We're done watching. If this is where it ends, at least it ends with us trying." Ronan wanted to argue, wanted to send them away for their own safety. But looking at their faces, worn, determined, finished with running, he realized that would be the worst kind of disrespect. These people had made their choice. He had no right to take it away from them. "All right," he said, "but we do this smart. No heroes, no stupid risks. You follow orders, you stay in cover, and if things go bad, you run. Understood?" Nods all around. Jack was already organizing them, his natural authority taking over. "Anyone who's actually shot a rifle before, over here. Everyone else, you're on supply duty, medical support, and maintaining sight lines. Samuel, you know anything about fortifications?" "Built a few stone walls in my time." "Good. Start reinforcing the western approach. That's where they'll hit us if they're smart." The next few hours were organized chaos. The townspeople moved with purpose, driven by equal parts determination and terror. They stacked supplies, positioned barricades, created firing positions that would give defenders cover while exposing attackers. Ronan watched it all come together, feeling like he'd accidentally started something much bigger than himself. This wasn't about one ranch anymore. This was about a town that had been beaten down for years finally finding its spine. "They're going to get hurt," Eliza said quietly, standing next to him as they supervised. "Most of them, anyway." "I know. You okay with that?" "No, but I'm less okay with telling them they don't have the right to fight for themselves." He turned to look at her. "You?" Terrified, but also, she paused, searching for words. Also relieved. "For a year I thought I was alone in this. Turns out I wasn't. The whole town was just waiting for someone to go first. That someone was you. You sent those letters. You documented everything. You did the work. I made a lot of noise in an empty room. You actually answered. Team effort, Ronan said, and managed something that might have been a smile. By midnight, the ranch looked like a military encampment. Guards rotated on watch, supplies were inventoried, positions were assigned. Tommy had been moved from the barn to the house's second floor, where he had a clear view of both approaches and a telescope borrowed from someone's attic. Mrs. Chen had taken over the kitchen, producing coffee and sandwiches from supplies that seemed to multiply through sheer force of will. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd fed large groups before, delegating tasks, accepting no arguments. You should sleep, she told Ronan when she caught him still moving at 2 a.m. Tomorrow's going to be ugly. Can't. Because you're planning or because you're scared? Both. She handed him coffee that was actually fresh for once. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's the people who aren't scared I worry about. You scared? Terrified. I'm old, I'm tired, and I've survived too much to want to die defending someone else's ranch. She sipped her own coffee. But I'm also done watching bad men win because good people are too afraid to stop them. So here I am, making sandwiches and pretending that's enough. It is enough. All of this, Ronan gestured at the organized chaos around them, wouldn't be happening without you. Maybe. But pretty words don't stop bullets, Mr. Hale, and tomorrow, that's what we're going to need. She was right, of course. Ronan had been in enough fights to know how this would go. Vane would come with overwhelming force, expecting the defenders to break immediately. When they didn't, he'd escalate. More guns, more pressure, more violence until either the defenders surrendered or everyone was dead. The question was how long they could hold, and whether help would arrive before the answer became moot. Jack found him an hour before dawn, looking as tired as Ronan felt. Photos are developed. They're good, clear enough to read, detailed enough to prove fraud. How many copies? 5 sets. One's hidden here, one's with Mrs. Chen, one's with a friend of mine 2 towns over, and 2 are already in the mail. One to the territorial governor, one to a newspaper editor in Denver who's been writing about land fraud. How long until they arrive? Mail's slow. 5 days? Maybe a week. We need to hold for a week. We need to hold until Vane gets bored or runs out of men, which isn't the same thing. Jack pulled out a flask, took a drink, offered it to Ronan. I'm not going to lie to you. Our odds are terrible. We're defending a fixed position against a mobile force with better training and more resources. I know. But we've got high ground, good sight lines, and people who are fighting for something that actually matters. That counts for more than you'd think. Ronan took the offered flask, the whiskey burning warm against the cold dawn air. How many people you think we'll lose? Honestly? If we're lucky, only a few. If we're not, Jack shrugged. All of us. Cheerful. Honest. Jack took back the flask. But here's the thing. Every one of those people out there knows the risks. They chose to be here. That's got to mean something. Does it change the outcome? No, but it changes why we're fighting. Jack headed back toward the house. Get some rest. Sun's coming up soon, and once it does, all hell's going to follow. Ronan tried. He went to the room they'd set aside for him, lay down on a bed that was too comfortable for what the day held, and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come. Instead, his mind kept running scenarios, calculating odds, trying to find the angle that would let them survive this. There wasn't one. Not really. They were going to fight, and probably lose, and the only question was how much they'd cost Vane in the process. But maybe that was enough. Maybe making it expensive, making it public, making it impossible to ignore. Maybe that was victory of a sort. The sun rose over this valley in shades of red and gold, beautiful and indifferent to the violence it was illuminating. Ronan stood on the porch with his rifle, watching the horizon, waiting for the dust cloud that would signal approaching riders. It came at 8 o'clock. Tommy spotted them first, calling down from his position. Riders, eastern approach. I count 15, maybe 20. Everyone moved to positions with the kind of organized panic that suggested fear was winning over training. Ronan moved along the line, checking weapons, offering what encouragement he could manage. Remember, don't shoot until I give the word. Let them get close, let them commit, then make every bullet count. The riders came on steady, not rushing, confident in their numbers. As they got closer, Ronan could make out Kane in the lead, his arms still in a sling from their first encounter. Behind him were faces Ronan recognized from town, the deputies' men, plus hired guns brought in for exactly this purpose. They stopped just outside rifle range, spreading out in a line that looked professional. These weren't amateurs playing at violence. These were men who had done this before. Kane urged his horse forward alone, getting close enough to be heard but staying outside easy shooting distance. "Eliza Briggs, you're harboring a known arsonist and interfering with legal business. Send out Ronan Hale and we'll consider not burning this place to the ground." Eliza appeared on the porch next to Ronan, and he had to admire the steadiness in her voice when she shouted back, "The only criminals here are the ones working for Silas Vane. Leave now and we won't press charges for trespassing." Kane laughed, the sound ugly and hard. "Press charges? Girl, you're going to be dead or dispossessed by noon. You got no authority to press anything." "Federal marshals might disagree," Ronan called out. "We've got documented evidence of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. It's already on its way to Denver. Whatever you do here today is going to be investigated." That gave Kane pause. He turned to one of his men, exchanged words Ronan couldn't hear. The man rode back toward town, probably to report to Vane. "You're bluffing," Kane said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Try me." Kane sat on his horse for a long moment, clearly thinking through options. Finally, he shouted, "You've got 1 hour to surrender. After that, we're coming in, and anyone still holding a weapon gets treated as a hostile." He wheeled his horse and rode back to his men. They didn't leave, just settled in to wait, making it clear this wasn't a retreat, just a pause. "That bought us time," Jack said from behind Ronan, "but not much. How long you think before Vane sends reinforcements?" "Already on the way, probably. Kane's smart enough to know 15 men aren't enough to take a fortified position without casualties. He'll wait for overwhelming force. So we've got maybe an hour before this gets serious." "Less than that, I'd guess." Ronan turned to address the defenders. "Everyone listen. They're going to come back with more men, better weapons, and a plan to end this fast. This is your last chance to leave. No one will think less of you." Nobody moved. Samuel spoke up from his position behind a reinforced window. "We're not going anywhere, Hale. You going to stand there talking, or are you going to tell us how we're actually going to survive this?" "Honestly, survival's not guaranteed. Best we can do is make it costly enough that Vane starts questioning whether this ranch is worth the trouble." "How do we do that?" "By not breaking. By making them work for every inch. By showing everyone watching that we're not afraid of them anymore." Ronan checked his rifle again, more from habit than necessity. "They're expecting us to fold immediately. When we don't, they'll get frustrated, make mistakes. That's when we hit them." The hour crawled past like pulling teeth. Defenders shifted nervously, checked weapons, tried not to think about what was coming. Mrs. Chen moved among them with water and quiet words, somehow finding the right thing to say to each person. Ronan spent the time studying the terrain, looking for advantages. The ranch house sat on a slight rise, giving them elevation. The approaches were open ground, providing good fields of fire. The barn and outbuildings created natural choke points. It wasn't perfect, but it was defensible. The problem was that defense was always temporary. Eventually, attackers could just wait you out, starve you, burn you. The only way defense won was if help arrived or the attackers gave up. Neither seemed likely. The messenger returned at the 50-minute mark, accompanied by another 30 riders. Ronan recognized some of them, more of Kane's deputies, ranch hands from Vane's spread, hired guns with the kind of faces that advertised their profession. And in the middle of them, riding a black horse like he was leading a parade, was Silas Vane himself. The man looked different out here than in his study, smaller somehow, less imposing without the trappings of wealth around him. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, completely certain of his victory. The combined force formed up just outside rifle range, 50 men, maybe more. Ronan did the math automatically. 5 defenders for every one of theirs. Better weapons, better position, but vastly outnumbered. This was going to be ugly. Vane rode forward with Kane and Finch flanking him. He stopped at the same spot Kane had used, close enough to talk, far enough to be safe. "Miss Briggs." His voice was smooth, almost friendly. "This has gone far enough. You're in default of a legal contract. The property transfers to my ownership at noon today. Resisting this process is pointless and will only result in unnecessary bloodshed." Eliza stepped to the edge of the porch. The contract was fraudulent. We have evidence. Legal authorities are already reviewing it. What authorities? The territorial marshal who hasn't responded to your letters? The governor's office that sent your complaints to the local sheriff? Vane's smile was visible even at this distance. There are no authorities coming to save you, Miss Briggs. There's only the law, and the law says this property is mine. Then come and take it. That was Jack, shouting from a window. Let's see how many of your men are willing to die for your paperwork. Vane's expression hardened. So be it. I gave you every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. What happens now is on your heads. He turned his horse and rode back to his men. Ronan watched as they organized, Kane and Finch issuing orders, men moving into formation. They were going to do this properly, spread out, multiple angles of attack, overwhelming force applied simultaneously. Here they come, Tommy called from above. All of them! The attack began with gunfire. Not aimed shots, just volume. 50 rifles opening up more or less simultaneously, throwing lead at the ranch house to suppress defenders and create chaos. Windows shattered, wood splintered, the air filled with the distinctive crack of bullets finding solid objects. Stay down! Ronan shouted, though most people had already figured that out. Don't return fire until they're close. The shooting continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 90 seconds. Then it stopped, and in the sudden silence, Ronan could hear horses moving, men advancing under the cover of gun smoke. They're coming, Samuel called out. Eastern approach, maybe 20 of them. West side too, someone else shouted. Another group flanking. Ronan had positioned himself at a central point where he could see both approaches. East side, wait until they're 50 yards, then open up. West side, same thing. Make your shots count. The eastern group came first, riders pushing hard across open ground. They were brave. Ronan would give them that. Charging a fortified position took either courage or stupidity, and the line between them was thin. At 60 yards, Ronan shouted, Eastern defenders, ready! At 55 yards, aim! At 50 yards, fire! The volley wasn't perfect. Some shots went wide, some high. A few didn't fire at all because defenders froze or fumbled. But enough hit that 3 riders went down, horses screamed, and the charge faltered. Reload! Fire at will! The defenders started shooting independently now, some taking careful aim, others just pulling triggers as fast as they could. More attackers fell, but they were still coming, getting closer with each second. On the west side, the flanking group had reached the outbuildings and were using them for cover. They'd dismounted, were shooting from protected positions, trying to suppress the defenders long enough for the eastern charge to reach the house. Jack, western position needs support. On it! Jack appeared with 3 men, moving to reinforce that side. Gunfire intensified, bullets flying in both directions, the sound overwhelming in the morning air. The eastern charge broke at 30 yards. They'd lost too many men, too many horses, and the survivors realized death was more certain than victory. They wheeled and rode back, dragging wounded with them, leaving bodies in the grass. A cheer went up from the defenders, quickly silenced by Ronan's shout. They're regrouping. Reload. Check your ammunition. This isn't over. He was right. Vane's men fell back but didn't leave. They'd learned what they needed to know. The ranch was defended, attackers would die, but the defenders were amateurs who'd gotten lucky more than skilled. Next time would be different. Ronan used the lull to move among the defenders, checking for injuries. Margaret had taken a splinter to the arm when a bullet shattered the window frame she'd been shooting from. One of the men from town, Ronan didn't know his name, had been grazed across the shoulder but was still functional. Everyone else was shaken but intact. We hurt them, Samuel said, reloading with hands that shook slightly. Didn't we? We actually hurt them. We did, but they've got 50 men. We just convinced them they can't take us with a simple charge. Now they'll get creative. What does creative mean? Probably fire. Maybe waiting us out. Definitely something we're not going to like. Eliza appeared, face smudged with powder smoke. We've got wounded out there. 3 men down in the grass, 1 still moving. It's a trap, Ronan said immediately. They want us to go out there, expose ourselves. So we just let him die? We just don't die trying to save him. Ronan moved to a window, studied the field. The wounded man was crawling, trying to reach cover, leaving a blood trail in the dirt. Anyone who goes out there gets shot before they make it 10 feet. That's cold. That's survival. Ronan turned to face her. You want to save him? Go ahead, but you'll die, and it won't change anything except the body count. Eliza stared at him for a long moment, anger and understanding warring on her face. Finally, she nodded and moved away. The wounded man made it another 15 feet before collapsing. Nobody went to help him. Nobody could. Vane's next move came 20 minutes later. A group of riders approached under a white flag. Not to surrender, but to talk. Kane rode in front, his voice carrying across the distance. We're offering terms. Send out Ronan Hale, and the rest of you can leave unharmed. You have 10 minutes to decide. It's a lie, Jack said. Soon as they get Ronan, they'll kill everyone anyway. I know. Ronan called back to Kane. Counteroffer. Vane leaves the valley, drops all claims to this property, and we don't send your organization's fraudulent records to every lawman west of the Mississippi. We both know those records don't matter. No marshal's going to investigate on your word. Maybe not, but newspapers will publish them. And once your operation's front-page news, those marshals won't have a choice. Ronan was gambling now, hoping his bluff sounded more certain than he felt. Every day this drags on, more people hear about it. More questions get asked. Eventually, even your bought judges won't be able to protect you. Kane conferred with someone behind him, probably Finch, probably weighing whether the threat was real. After a minute, he shouted back, Last chance, surrender Hale, or we burn you out. Then burn us out. But we're not surrendering. The white flag came down. Kane and his group rode back to the main force. That was stupid, Eliza said. They're definitely going to burn us now. They were always going to burn us. At least this way we're loud about why. Ronan turned to address the defenders. They're going to try fire next. Wet down everything you can reach. Get ready to evacuate if the house becomes untenable. People moved with practiced efficiency now, fear giving way to focused action. Buckets of water appeared, precious liquid being splashed on walls and floors. Escape routes were confirmed. Medical supplies were staged for quick access. Mrs. Chen supervised it all, somehow maintaining calm in the chaos. You know we can't hold if they burn us, she said to Ronan. I know. So what's the actual plan? Hope they run out of matches? Hope they realize this is costing them more than it's worth. Every minute we hold, Vane looks weaker. Every man he loses, his reputation takes a hit. Ronan checked his ammunition, running low like everyone else. We just need to make it expensive enough that walking away seems smarter than pushing forward. That's a terrible plan. You got a better one? No, that's what worries me. The fire came as flaming arrows shot from safe distance to arc over the defenders' positions and land on the roof. Primitive but effective. Within minutes, multiple small fires were burning, smoke beginning to fill the upper floor. Fire brigade, Jack shouted. Everyone not shooting, get up there with buckets. People scrambled, passing water up the stairs, trying to douse flames before they spread. But more arrows kept coming, faster than the defenders could respond. The smoke got thicker, heat building, making the second floor untenable. Tommy, get down from there, Ronan called up. Tommy appeared at the stairs, coughing, eyes watering. Can't see anyway, too much smoke. Everyone to ground floor positions. Let the second floor burn, defend from down here. It was a calculated retreat, trading high ground for safety. But it also meant giving up visibility, reaction time, defensive advantage. The attackers would know it too, would push harder now that they'd forced a withdrawal. Ronan was trying to organize the compressed defensive line when he heard horses again. Not from the east or west this time, from the north. The one approach they'd left lightly defended because it required crossing the creek and climbing a steep bank. Vane's men were hitting all three sides simultaneously. Jack, take 10 people north position. Hold them at the creek. Jack grabbed whoever was closest and ran, leaving Ronan to defend two sides with whoever remained. The math was getting worse by the minute. The northern attack was actually a feint, a small group making noise to draw defenders away from the real assault, which came from the east again. 20 riders, moving fast, using the smoke from the burning house as cover. They made it to 40 yards before defenders spotted them. By then, it was almost too late. East side, contact! Gunfire erupted, frantic and disorganized. Riders fell, but more kept coming. At 20 yards they split, half continuing toward the house, half peeling off to attack the barn where Samuel and his group were positioned. Ronan fired, reloaded, fired again. A rider went down 5 feet from the porch. Another made it to the wall. was climbing off his horse when Margaret shot him from a window. The body fell, horse bolted, chaos multiplied. The barn group was getting overwhelmed. Samuel was shouting something, but Ronan couldn't hear over the gunfire. Then the barn doors opened and defenders came running out, driven by smoke Ronan hadn't even seen start. "They fired the barn!" someone screamed. "Fall back to the house! Move!" The barn defenders ran across open ground, exposed and vulnerable. 2 went down before reaching safety. The others made it inside, bringing the smell of smoke and fear with them. Now both the house and barn were burning. The defenders were compressed into an ever-shrinking space. Ammunition was running low, and Vane's men were learning, adapting, getting smarter with each assault. They were losing. Slowly but certainly, they were losing. Ronan found Eliza in the chaos, grabbed her shoulder. "We need to start evacuating non-combatants. Anyone who can't shoot needs to leave now while we can still cover their retreat." "Where will they go?" "Town, woods, anywhere but here. This position's collapsing." Eliza looked like she wanted to argue, but the house chose that moment to partially collapse, the second floor giving way with a groan of tortured wood, sending a shower of embers into the rooms below. "All right," she shouted. "Mrs. Chen, get anyone not actively fighting and get them out. Use the Western Creek approach. Stay low. Move fast." Mrs. Chen didn't argue, just started gathering people. Maybe a dozen in total. The injured, the exhausted, those who'd frozen in combat and realized they weren't cut out for this. They moved toward the back of the house, preparing to make a run for it. Ronan positioned himself to cover their escape, along with Jack and 3 others. When Mrs. Chen gave the signal, they opened fire on Vane's positions, not to hit anything, just to create noise and make the attackers keep their heads down. The evacuees ran. Most made it. 2 didn't, cut down by opportunistic shots, bodies crumpling in the grass. The survivors kept running, disappearing into the creek bed, heading for whatever safety Cold Creek might offer. If Cold Creek offered any safety at all anymore. With the non-combatants gone, maybe 15 defenders remained. 15 people with dwindling ammunition, no high ground, and buildings burning around them. The house was becoming untenable. Heat and smoke making it hard to breathe, hard to see, hard to do anything except wait for the end. "We can't hold much longer," Jack said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Maybe another hour if we're lucky." "Then we hold for another hour." Ronan reloaded his rifle one more time, counting bullets automatically. 8 left. After that, it would come down to his pistol, and after that didn't bear thinking about. The next assault came from all 3 sides at once. Vane had finally committed everything, probably figuring the defenders were broken enough to overrun. Horses, men, guns, all converging on a burning ranch house defended by a handful of stubborn fools. The defenders fired everything they had, but it wasn't enough. Attackers made it to the porch, to the walls, started breaking down doors. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the doorways, brutal and close and personal. Ronan shot a man trying to climb through a window, then used his rifle as a club when another appeared. Someone, Samuel, maybe, was screaming. Glass shattered, wood splintered, the whole world compressed into a series of violent moments strung together by adrenaline and terror. And then, cutting through the chaos like a knife, came the sound of a bugle. Everyone froze. Attackers and defenders alike turned toward the sound, trying to understand what it meant. Over the eastern rise, backlit by morning sun, came riders. A lot of riders. Moving in formation, carrying flags Ronan recognized even through the smoke. United States cavalry. The federal marshals had arrived. Vane's men saw them and broke immediately. No organization, no retreat plan, just pure panic. They abandoned the assault, ran for their horses, scattered in every direction like rats from a sinking ship. Kane tried to maintain order, shouting commands nobody followed. Finch was already riding away, leaving his employer to face whatever came next. Within 2 minutes, the attacking force had disintegrated from organized assault to desperate flight. The cavalry came on at a trot, professional and unhurried. They'd seen the situation, understood it, and were moving to secure the area rather than chase fleeing men. A small group split off to pursue obvious leaders, but most stayed to establish control. The officer in charge, a captain in his 30s with the kind of face that had seen too much frontier violence, rode up to where Ronan stood on the burning porch. "Captain William Morrison, United States Marshals Service. Someone here named Ronan Hale?" "That's me." We received urgent communications regarding fraud, arson, and unlawful attempts to seize property. You the one who sent them? I am, or my associates did. Documentation's inside, assuming it hasn't burned. Morrison looked at the smoldering house, the bodies in the yard, the exhausted defenders. Looks like we're late to the party. Better late than never. Debatable. Morrison dismounted, started issuing orders. Secure the perimeter, medical attention for wounded, and someone get water on these fires before the whole place burns to ash. His men moved with military efficiency, transforming chaos into order within minutes. Injured were tended to, fires were fought, witnesses were separated for questioning. The machinery of federal law enforcement grinding into motion, slow but inexorable. Eliza appeared beside Ronan, looking like she'd been through a war, which he supposed she had. Is it over? Maybe. Depends on what evidence survived, what Morrison believes, how much authority he's actually got. But they're here. That has to mean something. It means someone read our letters and decided to investigate. Whether that investigation goes anywhere, Ronan shrugged. We'll find out. Morrison returned, notebook in hand. I need statements from everyone involved. But first, I need to know where Silas Vane is. Was here 20 minutes ago. Probably ran when you showed up. We've got men tracking. He won't get far. Morrison studied Ronan carefully. You look like military. What'd you serve? Missouri Irregulars, then regular Army after 63. Infantry mostly. That explains the tactical thinking. This position was well defended. Not well enough. We were about 30 seconds from being overrun when you arrived. Timing's everything. Morrison flipped a page in his notebook. The communications we received mentioned arson, specifically targeting Vane's freight operation and timber yard. You know anything about that? Ronan met his eyes steadily. I know there were fires. I know they were convenient for our purposes. Beyond that, I'm not sure what you're asking. Morrison smiled slightly. I'm asking whether you committed federal crimes while trying to stop other federal crimes, because that's going to complicate my report. What if I said the fires were accidents? Then I'd say you're a liar. But I'd also say that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, and I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference. He closed the notebook. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to investigate Vane's operation based on the evidence you've provided. If that evidence supports criminal charges, I'll pursue them. If it also shows you committed crimes, I'll have to address that too. Fair enough. But here's what you need to understand. I can't make promises. I can't guarantee outcomes. The law is what it is, even when it's frustrating. Morrison looked around at the burning ranch, the bodies, the destruction. All I can promise is that I'll do my job honestly. That's going to have to be enough. It's more than we had yesterday. Morrison nodded and moved on to interview other witnesses. Ronan watched him work, professional and thorough, and tried to decide if this was victory or just a different kind of problem. Jack appeared, face blackened with soot. We lost 3 people, Samuel, Margaret, and a guy from town whose name I never learned. Another 5 wounded, 2 seriously. The ones who evacuated? Made it to town. Mrs. Chen's got them organized, getting medical help. Jack looked at the house, flames finally dying under the cavalry's water efforts. Place is pretty much a total loss. What's left standing won't be worth saving. But the land's still here. The creek still runs. That's what matters. You really believe that? After all this? Ronan thought about it. Yeah, I do. Buildings can be rebuilt. Land endures. The cavalry spent the rest of the day securing the area and taking statements. They found Vane trying to flee north with Finch and 2 loyalists. Found Kane hiding in a root cellar in town. Rounded up maybe a dozen of the men who'd participated in the assault. The evidence was retrieved from where it had been hidden. The photographs, the ledgers, Eliza's journal of documentation. Morrison reviewed it all with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was building a real case, not just going through motions. As the sun set on what was left of the Briggs Ranch, Morrison called Ronan and Eliza to his temporary command post. I've seen enough to proceed with charges, he said without preamble. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and about a dozen violations of federal banking law. Vane and his key lieutenants will be transported to Denver for trial. What about the ranch? Eliza asked. The property seizure was based on fraudulent contracts. Those contracts are void. The property remains yours, Miss Briggs. Morrison paused. Though I'm not sure what you're going to do with burned buildings and dead livestock. Rebuild. Same as we've been doing. Eliza's voice was steady despite everything. This land's been in my family for 2 generations. It'll be here for 2 more. Morrison nodded approval. As for you, Mr. Hale, I have credible evidence you were involved in the fires that destroyed Vane's property. That's arson, and I can't ignore it. Understood. However, I also have evidence that Vane's operation was systematically destroying this community through illegal means, and I have a dozen witnesses who will testify that his men attacked this ranch unprovoked. Morrison tapped his notebook. So here's my recommendation. You leave Cold Creek. Today, right now. And in exchange, my investigation will focus on Vane's crimes rather than yours. You're letting him go? Eliza's voice rose. After everything, I'm acknowledging that justice sometimes requires compromise. Vane and his organization will face federal prosecution. That's victory. Making this messier by pursuing charges against someone who is clearly acting in defense of this community? Morrison shrugged. That serves the law, but not justice. Ronan looked at Eliza, saw the protest forming, shook his head slightly. I accept those terms. Just like that? Eliza turned to face him. You're leaving? Was always going to leave eventually. This just moves up the timeline. But, Eliza, let it go. Morrison's giving us the best outcome we could hope for. Don't make it complicated. She looked like she wanted to argue more, but something in Ronan's expression stopped her. Finally, she nodded. Fine. But you're staying for the night at least. We owe you that. You don't owe me anything. We owe you everything. Her voice cracked slightly. So the least you can do is let us say goodbye properly. That night, what was left of Cold Creek gathered in the town square. Someone had organized food, drink, a fire that provided light and warmth against the October chill. The cavalry kept their distance, giving the town space to process what had happened. People came up to Ronan one by one, thanking him, shaking his hand, offering blessings he didn't deserve. He accepted it all with awkward grace, never quite sure what to say to people who treated him like a hero, when he mostly felt like someone who'd gotten lucky. Mrs. Chen found him sitting apart from the crowd, nursing coffee and watching the stars. You really leaving tomorrow? Don't have much choice. You always have choice. Question is what you choose to do with it. She sat next to him, small and impossibly old. You could stay. Help rebuild. This town could use someone like you. Town needs to learn to defend itself. I'm a crutch at best, a problem at worst. Maybe, but you're also the reason we're sitting here tonight instead of burying bodies and mourning a lost cause. She sipped from her own cup. What will you do? Where will you go? Haven't decided. Somewhere that needs help, probably. Somewhere broken that might be fixable. You got a savior complex, Mr. Hale. Maybe. Or maybe I just can't sit still when I see injustice. He looked at her. What about you? You staying? I'm old and tired and this is my home. Where else would I go? She smiled slightly. Besides, someone needs to make sure Eliza doesn't work herself to death rebuilding. She'll be all right. She's tougher than any of us. She is, but tough doesn't mean invincible. Mrs. Chen stood, bones creaking. You should talk to her before you leave. He found Eliza by the ruins of what had been the ranch house, staring at the blackened timbers. The cavalry had put out the fires, but the damage was total. Nothing worth saving except the memories. You okay? Ronan asked. Define okay. She didn't look at him. My home's destroyed, 3 people died defending it, and the man who helped save it is leaving tomorrow. So no, I'm not okay. But I'm alive, the ranch is still mine, and Vane's in chains, so maybe I'm as okay as I'm going to get. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About all of it. Don't be. None of this is your fault. You answered a letter from a desperate stranger and somehow managed to keep us alive despite impossible odds. That's not something to apologize for. They stood together in silence, watching moonlight paint the valley in silver. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The sound echoed off the hills, lonely and wild and somehow right. What will you do? Ronan asked finally. With all this? Rebuild. Like I said, Jack knows construction, and there's people in town who'll help. We'll have a new house up before winter, barn by spring. She turned to look at him. And you? Where does a man like you go after this? Wherever the next letter finds me, I guess. That's not much of a plan. It's the only one I've got. Ronan pulled out the worn letter she'd sent, the one that had brought him here. You asked for help. I came. That's how it works. And if no one else asks, then I find someone who needs it but hasn't figured out how to ask yet. He handed her back the letter. Keep this. Reminder that asking for help isn't weakness. She took it, folded it carefully, tucked it in her pocket. Thank you, Ronan, for everything. Thank you for trusting me. That's rarer than you think. They talked for another hour about nothing and everything, plans for the ranch, memories of people lost, hopes for a future that felt more possible now than it had a week ago. When they finally parted, it was with the understanding that some goodbyes weren't really endings, just pauses in a longer conversation. Ronan left at dawn, before the town fully woke. He'd said his goodbyes the night before, and lingering would just make it harder. His horse was saddled, his gear packed, his guns cleaned and loaded more from habit than expectation of trouble. The valley looked different in morning light, still beautiful, still harsh, but somehow more hopeful. Smoke no longer rose from burning buildings. Bodies had been buried or removed. The visible wounds were healing, even if the invisible ones would take longer. He was a mile out when he heard hoofbeats behind him. Tommy rode up, looking determined and nervous in equal measure. You weren't going to say goodbye? The kid asked. Said goodbye last night. To everyone but me. Ronan reined in his horse. All right. Goodbye, Tommy. You did good. Better than good. You've got potential. Take me with you. What? Take me with you, wherever you're going, whatever you're doing next. I want to learn, want to be useful. Tommy, I'm serious. I've spent my whole life being scared, being useless, watching bad things happen because I didn't know how to stop them. Then you showed up and proved one person could make a difference. I want to be that person. Ronan looked at the kid, young, earnest, still carrying the bruises from a fight he'd barely survived, and saw himself 20 years ago. Same idealism, same determination, same absolute certainty that violence could solve problems if applied correctly. It had taken him 2 decades to learn different, to understand that violence was a tool, not a solution, that some problems couldn't be shot, some wrongs couldn't be righted, some people couldn't be saved no matter how hard you tried. You don't want this life, Ronan said quietly. It's lonely, dangerous, and it doesn't end well for most people who choose it. Maybe, but it's better than going back to being afraid all the time. There's other ways to be brave, other ways to make a difference. Name one. Stay here. Help Eliza rebuild. Make sure what we started actually takes root. That's harder than riding off looking for the next fight. Ronan met Tommy's eyes. Anyone can burn things down. Building them back up, that takes real courage. Tommy looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Ronan's voice, or maybe just the early morning clarity, made him nod instead. All right, I'll stay. But if you ever need help, I'll know where to find you. Ronan extended his hand. Tommy shook it, gripped firm despite the trembling. What you did here, Tommy said, it mattered. You know that, right? Maybe. Ask me in 10 years. I will. Ronan rode on, leaving the kids standing in the road, backlit by sunrise. In his mind, he cataloged what they'd accomplished. Vane in custody, the ranch saved, a town finding its spine. Not bad for 2 weeks' work. But he also cataloged the cost. 3 dead, more wounded, buildings burned, families traumatized. Lives disrupted in ways that would echo for years. Was it worth it? He didn't know. Maybe that was a question that didn't have answers, only consequences. The road stretched ahead, dusty and uncertain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another broken place was waiting. Another desperate letter would find its way to him. Another fight would need someone stupid or brave enough to take it on. Ronan urged his horse forward, toward whatever came next, carrying nothing but his guns and the weight of promises he'd made to himself about fixing things instead of breaking them. Behind him, Cold Creek stood as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, broken places could be made whole again. That empires built on fear could be toppled by people who finally decided enough was enough. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a world that offered precious few victories, something was enough. 3 months later, Ronan found himself in a town called Redemption, 60 miles south of the Wyoming border. The name was either aspirational or ironic. He hadn't decided which yet. What he had decided was that the whiskey was terrible, The hotel bed had more lumps than a sack of potatoes, and the letter that had brought him here was starting to feel like a mistake. The problem wasn't the cause. A mining company was forcing workers into debt slavery, paying in company scrip instead of real money, charging inflated prices at the company store, trapping families in cycles they couldn't escape. Classic exploitation, the kind Ronan had seen a dozen times in a dozen places. The problem was that the mining company's owner had heard about Cold Creek. "Mr. Hale," the man had said during their one conversation, his voice smooth with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "I understand you have a reputation for interfering in legitimate business operations. I want you to understand that such interference will not be tolerated here." It was a warning and a challenge wrapped together. And Ronan, tired and maybe a bit stupid, had taken it personally. Now he was sitting in a saloon that smelled like old beer and older regrets, trying to figure out his next move. The workers were scared. More scared than the people in Cold Creek had been. Because this wasn't just about land. This was about survival, about putting food on tables and keeping families alive through another winter. But they were also exhausted, beaten down by years of exploitation, hollowed out by the kind of poverty that killed hope before it killed bodies. When Ronan had tried to organize them, tried to explain that they had power if they used it together, he'd been met with dead eyes and quiet refusals. "We can't fight them," one worker had said. "They own everything, the mine, the store, the houses we live in. We fight, they throw us out. Then what? Where do we go?" Ronan hadn't had a good answer, because the man was right. Without alternatives, resistance was just suicide with extra steps. He was nursing his second terrible whiskey when a telegram arrived. The bartender brought it over with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he'd been paid to watch Ronan and report back. The telegram was from Eliza. "Stop. Vane trial concluded. Stop. Guilty on 17 counts. Stop. 20 years federal prison. Stop. Ranch rebuilt. Stop. Town recovering. Stop up. Thank you. Stop. Come visit sometime. Stop up." Ronan read it twice, trying to process the emotions the words stirred up. Relief that Vane had actually been convicted, that the system had worked for once. Pride that Eliza had rebuilt. And underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from realizing Cold Creek was the exception, not the rule. Most places didn't get happy endings. Most fights ended with the powerful staying powerful and the powerless staying broken. Cold Creek had gotten lucky. The cavalry had arrived. The evidence had held up. Justice had happened to align with the law. But redemption? Redemption wasn't going to be that lucky. The mining company was too big, too connected, too careful to leave the kind of evidence that could bring federal marshals running. And even if Ronan found a way to hurt them, there would just be another company, another town, another group of desperate people being ground down by forces they couldn't fight. He'd spent 3 months trying to replicate what happened in Cold Creek. 3 months of organizing, investigating, building cases that went nowhere. He'd managed some small victories, a few workers who'd escaped debt, a company store that mysteriously burned down, a foreman who developed a sudden urge to retire after his ledgers went missing. But nothing that mattered, nothing that changed the fundamental equation. The bartender was watching him, probably waiting to see if the telegram required a response. Ronan folded it carefully, tucked it in his pocket, and made a decision. He was done. Not done helping. He'd never be done with that. It was too deeply wired into who he was. But done trying to be everywhere, fix everything, carry the weight of every injustice he encountered. Cold Creek had worked because it was specific. One town, one problem, one clear enemy. He'd been able to focus everything on that single goal, and the combination of luck and timing and desperate courage had been enough. But trying to do that everywhere, all the time, that was just a slow way to destroy himself while changing nothing. Ronan finished his drink, paid his tab, and walked out into autumn sunlight that felt warmer than it had a right to. He'd already packed his gear, had learned years ago to keep everything ready for quick departures. Within an hour, he was on his horse, riding south with no particular destination in mind. The workers in Redemption would have to save themselves. Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. But it wasn't his job to save everyone, wasn't his responsibility to fix every broken system. He could only do what he could do. And right now, what he could do was put some distance between himself and the weight of expectations he'd been carrying. The ride took him through country that was getting ready for winter, trees losing leaves, grass going brown, that particular quality of light that suggested the world was preparing to sleep for a while. He made camp in places that had no names, talked to people who had no connection to his past or future, let the road erase the accumulated stress of fighting battles he couldn't win. 2 weeks into wandering, he found himself approaching Cold Creek almost by accident. Or maybe not accident, maybe some part of him had been steering toward it all along, looking for proof that what they'd accomplished had been real and lasting. The town looked different, better. Buildings had been repaired, fresh paint applied, the general sense of fear and desperation replaced by something that looked almost like hope. People moved on the streets without that hunted quality. Conversations happened without constant checking for eavesdroppers. Mrs. Chen's boarding house had a new sign, bright yellow instead of faded. The general store had expanded, and at the far end of town where Vane's bank had stood, someone had converted it into a community hall. Mrs. Chen was on her porch when Ronan rode up, like she'd been expecting him. Maybe she had been. That woman had a way of knowing things before they happened. "Mr. Hale, you look like something the cat dragged in and then thought better of." "Feel like it too." He dismounted, every joint protesting. "Didn't plan on coming back." "Nobody ever plans on coming back. But here you are anyway." She gestured to the chair next to hers. "Sit. Tell me about the last 3 months." So he did. Not everything, but enough. The towns he'd tried to help, the fights he'd started, the realization that he couldn't save everyone, and probably shouldn't try. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, the way old people could when they'd heard enough stories to know when silence was more valuable than advice. When Ronan finished, she said simply, "Good." "Good? You figured out what I knew the moment you rode in here, that you're one man with limits. Took you long enough." "Feels like failure." "That's because you're defining success wrong. Success isn't fixing everything. It's fixing what you can fix well, then having the sense to walk away before you destroy yourself trying to do the impossible." "So what? I just ignore suffering? Pretend it's not happening?" "You choose your battles. Help where you can actually make a difference, instead of spreading yourself so thin you're useless everywhere." She poured him coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the porch rail. "You helped us, really helped us. Not because you tried to solve every problem in the territory, but because you focused on this one problem until it was solved. That's worth more than 100 half-finished crusades." Ronan sipped the coffee, still terrible, some things never changed, and thought about that. The people in Redemption will figure out their own solution or they won't, but it's not your job to live their lives for them. Mrs. Chen looked at him with those ancient eyes. "You want to know what Eliza's doing?" "I got her telegram." "Telegram doesn't tell you everything. She's not just rebuilding the ranch, she's organizing the valley, getting families to work together, share resources, create systems so no one person can ever control everything again. It's working because she's here, committed, invested in the long term. And I'm not. You're not, and that's fine. You're a catalyst, not a builder. You break the logjam, create the possibility for change, then move on. But you can't be both catalyst and builder. You have to choose. What if I'm tired of breaking things? Then find something worth building and stay long enough to see it finished." She stood, bones creaking. "But first, go see Eliza. She's at the ranch, probably working herself to death. Take her some of this coffee so she knows I'm thinking of her." The ride to the ranch was familiar and strange at once. Same road, same creek, but everything touched by change. Where burned buildings had stood, new structures rose. The main house was smaller than the original, more practical than impressive, but solid. The barn was twice the size it had been, built to accommodate the cooperative venture Eliza had organized. He found her in the barn, of course, because where else would she be? She was working with 2 other ranchers, planning something involving cattle and shared grazing rights, and the kind of long-term thinking that assumed futures worth planning for. She spotted him before he could announce himself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Just took in the changes 3 months had wrought. She looked older, more tired, but also more settled, like she'd found where she belonged and stopped fighting the weight of it. "Ronan." His name in her voice carried a dozen questions. "Eliza." The other ranchers took the hint, made polite excuses, left them alone in the barn's cathedral space. "You came back," Eliza said. "Was in the area." Liar. But she smiled when she said it. "What happened? I heard you were in Redemption, fighting another land baron. Mining company, actually, but close enough. Ronan leaned against a support beam, suddenly aware of how bone-tired he was. Didn't work out like Cold Creek. They never do. We got lucky. Yeah. He looked around the barn, taking in the evidence of recovery. You've done well here. We've done well. Turns out when people aren't being terrorized, they're pretty good at working together. She moved closer, studying his face. But you didn't come back to admire my barn. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's wrong. I don't know. Ronan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated at his inability to articulate what he was feeling. I've been trying to do what we did here, everywhere else, but it doesn't work. It can't work. Because I'm just one person, and there's too much broken in this world. So what, you're giving up? I'm choosing better, or trying to. He met her eyes. Mrs. Chen said you're building something here, something that lasts. Trying to. It's slow, frustrating work, not as exciting as burning down corrupt operations. But more important, maybe? Eliza crossed her arms, that defensive posture he remembered from their first meeting. Why are you really here, Ronan? I don't know, maybe to see if what we did actually mattered. Maybe to remind myself that sometimes things work out. Maybe just because I didn't know where else to go. She considered that for a long moment. It mattered. We're still here, still fighting, still building. Vane's in prison, his organization scattered, and the Valley is figuring out how to be something other than afraid. Because of what we started. Because of what we all did together. You, me, Jack, Tommy, Mrs. Chen, all those people who showed up when it mattered. She uncrossed her arms, some of the defensiveness falling away. But if you're asking whether you specifically made a difference, yes, you did. We wouldn't have survived without you. And now? Now we're surviving fine, building actually, creating something worth protecting. She paused. You could stay, help with that part instead of always riding off to the next fight. I'm not good at staying. You never tried. I tried in Redemption, tried to organize workers, build coalitions, create change. All I managed was to make myself a target without actually helping anyone. That's different. You weren't invested there. You were just passing through, trying to fix problems on someone else's timeline. Eliza moved to the barn door, looking out at the valley. Here, you'd be part of something. Not leading it, not trying to save it, just contributing. Being part of a community instead of a lone crusader. Ronan joined her at the door. The valley stretched out under autumn sun, beautiful in a way that still caught him off guard. I don't know if I know how to do that. Neither did I, but I'm learning. She glanced at him. The question is whether you're willing to try. He wanted to say yes, part of him, the part that was exhausted by constant movement, tired of sleeping in strange beds, finished with fighting battles that never quite ended, wanted to accept immediately. But another part, the part that had defined him for 20 years, couldn't imagine staying still. Couldn't picture a life that wasn't about the next threat, the next injustice, the next desperate letter asking for help. I need to think about it, he said finally. Fair enough. But don't think too long. Valley's changing fast and opportunities don't wait forever. They talked for another hour about the ranch, the Valley's recovery, the way Vane's trial had created ripples throughout the territory. Other towns were paying attention, seeing that corruption could be challenged, that powerful men could face consequences. It wasn't revolution, but it was something. As the sun started setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and gold, Tommy appeared. He'd grown in 3 months, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. Less nervous energy, more quiet confidence. Ronan, heard you were back. Tommy extended his hand, grip firm and sure. Tommy, you look different. Feel different. Been helping Eliza organize the Valley cooperation. Turns out I'm better at talking than shooting. Smarter application of your talents. Learned from watching you. Tommy's smile was genuine. You staying, or is this another goodbye? Still deciding? Well, decide fast. We could use someone with your experience helping plan defenses. Not against Vane, against the next one like him, because there's always another one. After Tommy left, after dinner with Eliza and Jack, and a rotating cast of Valley families, after conversations that felt more like homecoming than he'd expected, Ronan found himself back at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. She was waiting on the porch, as always. You figure it out yet? She asked. Figure what out? Whether you're staying or going, Whether you're going to keep trying to save the world or whether you're going to help save this one small piece of it. Ronan sat in the chair that was starting to feel like his. What would I even do here? I'm not a rancher, not a builder, not anything useful for a growing community. You're someone who knows how to fight, how to organize, how to see patterns others miss. You think those skills don't have value in peacetime? Mrs. Chen shook her head. The valley needs defenses, needs planning, needs someone who understands that just because Vane's gone doesn't mean the threat is over. You could be that person. I could also ride away tomorrow and find another Cold Creek that needs help. You could. And you'd be doing exactly what you've been doing, running from one crisis to another, never staying long enough to see if what you built actually lasts. She looked at him directly. You're scared. Of what? Of succeeding. Of actually being part of something that works, something that endures. Because if you stay and it fails, that's on you. But if you leave, you can always tell yourself you did your part, and what happened after wasn't your responsibility. The words hit harder than Ronan expected. That's exactly it. You've spent 20 years being the man who shows up and fixes problems, then disappears before anyone can expect more from you. It's safe, it's familiar, and it lets you avoid the hard work of actually building something. I don't know how to build. I only know how to break, then learn. That's what everyone here is doing, learning how to create instead of just survive. Mrs. Chen stood. But you've got to make a choice, Mr. Hale. Because Cold Creek is moving forward whether you're part of it or not. That night, Ronan couldn't sleep. He lay in the too comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to untangle what he actually wanted from what he thought he should want. The easy path was to leave. Ride out at dawn, find the next crisis, repeat the pattern that had defined him for 2 decades. It was familiar, it was what he knew, and it came with the comforting illusion that he was making a difference. But Mrs. Chen was right. He was running from connection, from commitment, from the possibility that staying might mean more than leaving ever could. He thought about the workers in Redemption, the ones he'd left behind. They'd have to solve their own problems, yes, but maybe that was okay. Maybe real change only happened when people fought for themselves, not when someone rode in and fought for them. And maybe his role didn't have to be the lone crusader. Maybe it could be the experienced advisor, the tactical planner, the person who helped others build their own defenses instead of always being the defense himself. It was a different kind of heroism. Quieter, less dramatic, harder to measure, but possibly more valuable in the long run. As dawn broke over the valley, Ronan made his decision. He found Eliza at the new house, already working despite the early hour. She looked up when he approached, question clear in her expression. "I'm staying," he said. "Not forever, maybe, but long enough to help build what we started, long enough to make sure it actually works." The smile that crossed her face was worth every moment of doubt. "About time." "There's conditions." "Of course there are. I'm not a rancher. I don't know crops or cattle or any of that. But I know defense, I know tactics, I know how to spot threats before they become problems. That's what I can offer. That's exactly what we need. The valley's growing, other communities are watching, and we need someone who can help us protect what we're building." Eliza extended her hand. "Welcome home, Ronan." They shook on it, and Ronan felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility that he might actually belong somewhere. The next months proved harder than any fighting he'd done. Learning to be part of a community instead of a temporary solution required skills he'd never developed. Patience, compromise, the ability to see beyond immediate threats to long-term sustainability. He helped organize the valley's mutual defense cooperative, a network of ranches and farms that could respond to threats collectively. Not with violence as the first option, but with solidarity, documentation, and the kind of organized resistance that made exploitation expensive. Tommy became his assistant, learning tactics and strategy with the same determination he'd shown learning to shoot. Together, they created systems for communication, early warning, coordinated response. Eliza focused on the economic side, diversifying the valley's income, creating alternatives to dependence on any single buyer or market. She was brilliant at it, seeing opportunities others missed, building networks that made the whole valley stronger. Jack handled construction and infrastructure, his carpenter's knowledge invaluable for creating defensible positions that looked like ordinary buildings. Under his direction, the valley became simultaneously more welcoming and more difficult to threaten, And Mrs. Chen, ancient and seemingly immortal, served as the valley's memory and conscience. She remembered every deal, every agreement, every promise made and kept. She was the living archive of what they were building and why it mattered. 6 months after Ronan's return, a lawyer arrived from Denver representing a railroad company interested in running a spur through the valley. It was exactly the opportunity Vane had been positioning for, the development that would have made whoever controlled the land enormously wealthy. The old Ronin would have seen it as a threat, another powerful interest trying to exploit the valley. But this Ronin, the one who'd learned to think beyond simple conflict, saw it differently. The valley organized, not to fight the railroad, but to negotiate collectively. They hired their own lawyers, demanded fair compensation for land use, insisted on local hiring for construction, built-in protections against the kind of monopoly control that had enabled Vane's operation. The railroad company, expecting easy pickings, found themselves facing a community that understood its value and refused to be exploited. The negotiations took months, but eventually both sides reached an agreement that benefited everyone. When the contract was signed, Eliza hosted a celebration at the ranch. The valley turned out in force, families who'd lost everything under Vane, now thriving. Workers who'd been terrified, now confident. A community that had been dying, now building toward a future. Ronan stood apart from the celebration, watching. He'd never been comfortable with crowds, with being the center of attention. But watching these people, his people, he realized with some surprise, celebrating something they'd built together, he felt something unfamiliar. Pride, maybe. Or satisfaction. The sense that he'd finally found the thing worth staying for. Mrs. Chen found him, as she always did when he tried to hide. "You did good," she said simply. "We did good. All of us." "True, but you're the one who chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. That matters." "Does it? I mean, really? One valley out of thousands, one small victory in a world full of injustice. It matters to the people here. It matters to the families that aren't being exploited, the children who'll grow up without fear, the future that's possible because someone decided to fight for it." She looked up at him. "You wanted to fix things instead of break them. You did that. Be proud of it." Later, Ronan found himself talking with a young man from a neighboring valley. The man's story was familiar. A powerful interest trying to force families off their land. Local authorities either bought or intimidated, people too scared to fight back. The old Ronin would have saddled up immediately, ready to ride in and solve the problem personally. But this Ronin understood something different. "Here's what you do," he told the young man. "Document everything, every threat, every meeting, every transaction. Build a case they can't ignore. Then organize your community, not to fight, but to resist collectively. Make it more expensive to push you out than to negotiate fairly." "But how?" "I'll help you. Not by doing it for you, but by teaching you how to do it yourselves." Ronan pulled out paper, started sketching organizational structures, communication networks, the same systems that had worked for Cold Creek. "It won't be fast, and it won't be easy, but it'll be yours." The young man listened, asked questions, took notes. When he left, he carried knowledge instead of just hope. He carried the tools to save himself and his community. That, Ronan realized, was worth more than any single-handed rescue could ever be. A year after the fight that had saved Cold Creek, Ronan sat on the porch of the house he'd built, small, practical, his, and watched the sun set over the valley. The ranch house lights were visible in the distance, warm and welcoming. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout the valley, families settling in for the evening. It was peaceful. And somewhere along the way, he'd learned that peaceful didn't mean weak or complacent. It meant people had the space to build instead of constantly defending. It meant hope was possible instead of luxury. Eliza visited sometimes, bringing problems that needed tactical thinking or just company for quiet evenings. Tommy stopped by regularly, updating Ronan on the network of communities they were helping organize. Jack came around to argue about construction techniques and share terrible whiskey. And Mrs. Chen, impossibly old and somehow still vital, kept an eye on everyone, making sure the valley stayed true to what they'd built. Ronan still got letters, desperate pleas from places that needed help, injustices that demanded attention. But instead of writing out to each one personally, he built a network, taught people how to fight for themselves, created systems that could be replicated, shared, adapted. He'd learned that one man couldn't save the world, But one man could help build the tools that let people save themselves. And that was enough. More than enough, actually. It was everything. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that promised tomorrow would be worth seeing. Somewhere beyond the valley, other battles were being fought. Other injustices demanded attention. Other desperate people were sending letters into the void, hoping someone would care enough to help. And someone would. Maybe not him, maybe not immediately. But the network he'd helped build was growing, spreading, becoming something bigger than any single person. Cold Creek had been the beginning. One valley that had refused to accept corruption as inevitable, that had fought back and won, and then done the harder work of building something worth defending. Now other valleys were following that example. Other communities were organizing, resisting, creating alternatives to exploitation. The change was slow, incremental, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But it was real, and it was spreading. Ronan pulled the first letter from Eliza out of his pocket, the one that had started everything. The paper was worn thin from being folded and refolded, the ink faded but still readable. Please, they're taking everything. If someone finds this, if someone reads this and still believes in justice, we need help. He'd answered that call. And in answering it, he'd found something he didn't know he'd been searching for. A place to belong, a purpose beyond violence, a future that looked like building instead of breaking. The letter had said they needed help. But what Ronan had discovered was that he'd needed them just as much. Needed the reminder that change was possible, that communities could resist, that courage came in forms beyond just knowing how to fight. He tucked the letter back in his pocket, stood from his chair, and looked out at the valley one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to manage, new problems to solve. But tonight, Cold Creek stood as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys won. Not because they were stronger or meaner or more violent, but because they were smarter, more organized, more committed to each other than their opponents were to profit. That was the lesson Ronan had learned, the one he'd spend the rest of his life teaching to anyone who'd listen. Power came from solidarity, not just strength. Justice came from people refusing to accept injustice, not from lone heroes riding in to save them. And hope, real hope, the kind that lasted, came from building futures worth fighting for, then having the courage to defend them together. Ronan walked inside his small house, to the life he'd chosen over the one he'd been running, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The war wasn't over. It would never be over, because there would always be powerful men trying to exploit the vulnerable, always be injustice that demanded resistance. But the fight had changed. It wasn't about one man against the darkness anymore. It was about communities standing together, knowledge being shared, systems being built that made exploitation expensive and resistance possible. Cold Creek was just one valley. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Ronan had learned, were everything.